It's really wonderful and humbling, and I'm overjoyed to be here. And thank you to Bishop Sue and Pastor Ed and Pastor Edwin and Pastor Chris and all the pastors down in the Valley, Pastor Ann or Dean, Pastor Steve, Pastor Gabby, Pastor Jay. I've had the pleasure of getting to know them over the last year and visit their congregations. And I'm so excited about the work that they're doing and humbled at the opportunity to partner with them. So for those of you that are joining us in Seguin or on Zoom, I send you a big hug. I know we're having a little bit of technical glitches, and I ask for a little bit of compassion. I think part of the issue is the difference in bandwidth speed. So as much as I want you to see how handsome I am, maybe if you turn the camera off, you'll be able to get my sound a little bit better, and maybe it'll come like this disembodied sound coming from the heavens, so it'll work even better. Are the slides up? So this is what I called my remarks today. Mientras tanto, meanwhile, reflections on identity, values, and going back to basics, and that's basically what we're going to do. Where is the projector? Pastor Katie, do I advance or do? Oh, it would help if I turn this on. No, yeah, just go to the next one. All right, so that's what just hold it there for a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're here and who I am. So, as Pastor Edwin says, my name is Luis Torres. In the Valley, I go by Luis Torres Ostos, because UTRGV insists on using both our surnames. And I'm the founding dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. I've been down there 3 years now. More importantly, I'm somebody who cares deeply about our communities and who works hard to build bridges, to bring together all of the sectors of our society, from academia to government, to private businesses, to our faith-based organizations, to improve the quality of life of all of our communities, and to ensure the safety, worth, and dignity of all of the members of our communities. In my fields of work and service, as Edwin said, social work, psychology, public health, and medicine, which for us, work and service are all the same, we use terms like safety, worth, and dignity. When I come over to the faith-based world, the faith-based context, those terms still apply. And I believe their power is further enhanced because we speak about seeing the sacred in everybody, seeing Christ in our siblings and each other, and treating each other as Christ would treat us. So that's one of the things that we're going to be reflecting on today. And it is my humble asking, my prayer, that God softens the hearts of all of us a little bit and opens our ears so that we may feel and reflect together and leave at the end of the day with a shared goal of doing better, especially in this realm of social justice. So who am I? I'm not a pastor, though sometimes I play when I go into a church and go to the mic. And I was telling Pastor Katie, I always want to start with dearly beloved, we are gathered here today, right? But no, I am not a pastor. I'm not a member of the ELCA or of our Southwestern Texas Synod, although I've been visiting a lot of churches and keep feeling a little bit of a pull. Truthfully, I'm not even Lutheran, unless you count by marriage. My wife, Dernay, whom you're going to meet in a few moments, was raised Missouri Synod Lutheran. You heard that right. Although she went to Catholic school her whole life. Catholic elementary school, Catholic middle school, Catholic high school, Catholic college, the College of Mount St. Mary in Newburgh, New York, Catholic graduate school, Fordham University, good Jesuit university in New York City, her whole life. So naturally, she wants nothing to do with Catholics. So I'm surprised that she actually agreed to marry me, right? So, but you know, we've been doing this now for 22 years. She has stayed Lutheran and I have stayed Catholic, and Gabriella is on the fence, our daughter. In terms of my own faith journey, that's really interesting. I was born in Puerto Rico, as Edwin said. And no, I didn't know him before, 6 or 7 months ago. Yeah. Every time somebody knows I'm Puerto Rican, I know a Puerto Rican, maybe you know him, right? So no, I'd never met Edwin before, I was born into a Pentecostal family, believe it or not. But in those crazy things that happened in our communities, I was baptized Catholic as a newborn and raised Pentecostal, right? I guess they wanted to make sure. They wanted to have both sides covered. I converted to Catholicism at age 12, and I'll share with you a story about my conversion a little bit later, but hint, it was about love and not of the Christian kind. I've always been curious about faith, however, and I have friends from all faith traditions. I have worshiped in many places and with many faiths, from Catholic, Lutheran, and Episcopal or Anglican communities to Jewish synagogues, Muslim mosques, and Hindi temples, to name a few. Perhaps because of my own journey and my varied faith experiences, I've been blessed to work closely with many congregations across the US, including the LCA. In the past 15 years, I've worked closely with 3 different synods: the Gulf Coast Synod, the Florida Bahamas Synod. As Edwin said, I spoke at their synod last year, and actually Just Love is their theme. So, I was able to add some to that. And since last year, the Southwestern Texas Synod, your synod, Bishop Pedro introduced us, and here I am. So I am Catholic, and sometimes I joke around. We were talking about that in our small group. I call myself a recovering Catholic, but I'm still Catholic. And although I know that my people, the Catholics, don't play well with others, and we think we're the only ones in heaven, there's tons of jokes about that. I'm sure you've heard some of them. I have a deep belief that God calls us all to engage with each other, and I work hard to build or to leverage the organic bridges that already exist between our many faith-based communities. Besides my faith, or perhaps because of it, I am a clinical psychologist by training, a social work educator, administrator, and researcher by choice, and a passionate advocate for all our communities, especially the most vulnerable communities among us, by vocation. I have spent the past 40+ years working at the intersections of psychology, social work, public health, medicine, and faith in Puerto Rico, New York City, Missouri, Texas, and throughout Latin America. In a little bit, I'm going to invite you into my world and share a little bit more in detail about who I am. And then I'm going to invite you to do the same and invite each other into your worlds. Specifically speaking about our various identities, cultures, or group affiliations that we have. Those are all variations of the same theme. I'm going to do a little activity with you, and then I'm going to ask you to do it with each other. I think it's important that we do this because the work that all of us do as people of faith, often with people who are very similar to us, and increasingly with people who may be very different from us in some meaningful ways, is important work. And doing it well requires a lot of reflection, a lot of listening to ourselves, in addition to listening to God. I submit to you that who we are has everything to do with how we treat each other. Pastor Katie, can you go to the next slide? One more. Okay. So you'll hear me say many times over the course of the day that it's very easy to love my siblings and to see Christ in them when they're just like me. Right? And we're preachers of habit. As I look around the room, I notice, and when I do the exercise later, I'm gonna shake things up a little bit, because we're sitting with the people that we came in with, people that we worship with every single day, right? The people that we feel most comfortable with because they are just like us. When my siblings look like me, speak like me, believe like me, worship like me, love like me, vote like me, dress like me, when they are just like me or mostly like me, darn it, it's really easy to embrace them in Christian love. But we have to acknowledge, all of us, me too, those are both sides of whatever spectrum we're on, that the harder, that the more my sibling starts to look different from me, the harder it starts to become to see God in them, to acknowledge the sacred and the divine in them, to embrace them in Christian love, to treat them with dignity. And that's perfectly normal because it's human. If you go to the next slide, Pastor Katie, so the next one. So I always start, I do a lot of this work. You can call it in different ways: cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness, cultural grounding, cultural humility. I call it getting to know ourselves and each other. And so I talk a lot about discrimination. And my approach to this is really, really different from many other conversations like this that you may have had. My job is not to make you feel guilty. I'm not going to call you a racist or a bad person. And I'm not going to say that I'm perfect because I believe something differently from what you believe, right? To discriminate, as you see on the slide, at its most basic, means to recognize a distinction, a difference. How many of us are old enough to remember Sesame Street? Right. Do you remember that song? One of these things is not like the other, right? It wasn't judging. The song wasn't this thing is better than that thing, or that thing is better than this thing. They're just different, right? Different. Katie, the next one, please. All right. So why and I always start with this, actually, I'm seeing it up there. Duh. So, that to discriminate is normal if you're a human being, because it's wired into our brains for thousands and thousands of years. Since the time that humans started living together in small groups in caves, and we have plenty of evidence that this was actually the case, they learned that to survive, they had to stick together in their own communities, in their own tribes, right? And if somebody that didn't look like us came around, most likely they were from a different tribe and they were a threat, right? They threatened our tribe. They might take our food, right? They might kill our men and take our women, right? And so what did we do? We reacted. We shot before we even knew who they were. Sounds very familiar today. You're knocking on the door and you get shot. Before I even ask, hey, what's up? You get into the wrong car, you get shot. So it's perfectly normal. Pastor, can you go to the next one, Pastor Katie? And we still do it mostly today without thinking. This is a picture of an immigrant that I met in Honduras last year at a shelter, a Catholic-run shelter. He was from Cuba, and there was a highly educated man in Cuba, sold everything he had, moved to Venezuela, got to Venezuela, crossed over to Colombia, crossed over to Panama, crossed the Darien jungle from Colombia to Panama on foot with the group that he was in. Soon as they got to Panama, the Panamanian government is very, very good to immigrants, They put them in buses as soon as they cross over, and they take them to the other end of the border, right? It's better than just leaving them to their own. And so took them to the border to Nicaragua. And as soon as they crossed over to Nicaragua, the entire group was mugged and beaten and stole everything they stole. And they kept on with their journey, pressing on. Thankfully, they survived. And then they came to Honduras, where they were immediately incarcerated. Well, not incarcerated, arrested and processed and detained. And at that time, the Honduran government was assessing a $240 fee per person, an administrative fee, before they were allowed to continue to the next border. So they were all hanging out at the shelter, trying to figure out how do they get $240 for each of them, right? This guy was an engineer, and he had the sign, and in the sign, basically says something like, "I'm an immigrant, I'm looking for any work, help me so I can get to the next border," right? And we see them all the time here, asking for money, asking, I need to eat, I can't feed my kids, whatever the case might be. And, all of us, if we're going to be honest, all of us, what we do in that moment, I do it myself, and I do this work for a living. God, don't let the light change. Let it stay green. Let it stay green. I don't want to stop at the red light. I don't want to make eye contact. And if the light happens to change red, instinctively, I make sure that my lock is on, right? And I have to I make a choice every single time. I make a choice to engage differently, even if I don't have a single penny to give him, to give dignity, to make eye contact, to open the window, to say, good morning, how's it going? God bless you. If I have something to give, I give it. And I don't, I give 2 minutes of conversation, which is recognizing that that person exists and the dignity, right? That's hard to do. That's what we're doing. You know, we ignore each other, except when it's time to scream at each other. So what we're here to do today is to engage in conversation and to reflect on what all this means, to learn some concrete tools and strategies to move forward in conversation and in engagement, in the hope that it'll help us all recognize that we are a very broad tent. I don't care what denomination you're talking about, if you're Lutherans, Catholics, Presbyterians, whichever one, we're a very broad tent, a very diverse community that worships together and works together every single day, even though we may not always march in lockstep. If we can do that, we can figure out how we can stay together, worship together, and brings God, love, and justice to the world together. Why is it important that we do this? Because to live our faith more fully, we have to acknowledge that we're human beings and that we have imperfections, and that as Christians, we also have imperfections. In faith, like in everything else in life, we have to work really hard every single day to hone our craft, to perfect our skill, to become better Christians and better human beings. I don't believe God requires or demands perfection of us, but I am certain that God requires effort from us, continuous effort and self-reflection that can help us understand why we believe what we believe, why we do what we do to ourselves and to others, the good and the not so good, why sometimes we can be someone's healer and other times their tormentor. Every single one of us is both Saul and Ananias, sometimes simultaneously. What matters most is what we do meanwhile. As we reflect on all of this and on the theme of the Synod Learning Day, let us accept that we will struggle with some challenging questions, that we're going to be uncomfortable at times, regardless of where we stand on a particular issue. I'd like for all of us to accept that as a fact and to still move forward in a spirit of openness, of faith, and of love. To do that safely, I want to take a few moments to invite us all to engage around some shared agreements about how we're going to do this together. I think this is necessary to make sure that we all feel safe enough to put ourselves front and center of the discussion, to acknowledge our vulnerabilities and our imperfections, and to grow from these reflections. So we're going to be discussing some potentially hot topics. How do we maintain a safe space where we can have some robust discussions? So please help me brainstorm some what we call group agreements or group norms that we can all live with and that can help guide our conversations today. Most of you have been part of other groups at work, in your communities. You've been in group therapy, you know it, okay? Where you start by establishing some common agreements. So just raise your hand, yell out, you know, if you're on Zoom, type it in, or if you're at the other location as well, and type up some agreements that you think will help us feel safe in our discussion. For example, some people might say, well, one person speak at a time when it's time for you to talk. Let's not talk over each other. What's a few others? What are some other agreements? Let's start here in the room and then we'll go to Zoom and Seguin. What are some things that would make us feel safer? I just threw one out there, one at a time. Yes, ma'am. I statements. I statements. Yes, use I statements. Don't speak for others. Speak only for yourself. Thank you.
Don't let your face get away with your
Yes, 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 yes.
Language at a meeting.
Yes.
Wow. And your facial expression was completely as opposed to
A picture paints 1,000 words. Yeah. I would have loved to see Ananias' face when God told him that he needed to go to Saul. You want me to do what? Yes. Thank you. Yes, our body language. Don't let our face betray, you know, that we are in not just in disagreement, sometimes viscerally disagreeing with the other person. Yes. Be mindful of our body language. Thank you for that. Yes. Don't be critical, right? Don't be critical, right? Keep another way to say keep an open mind. right? Keep an open mind. You know, we don't have to be right all the time. Don't be critical. Anybody, anything on chat? Katie? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I like the one about, you know, you don't always have to respond. You know, I notice I'm a clinician by training, and many of my trainees, social work students, psychology students, psychiatry residents, they always want to know about self-disclosure, right? That, you know, how to use it, is it appropriate? And what I always tell them, it's a tool. It's one more tool that you have in your toolbox. But you know, it shouldn't be the first one that you go to, and it shouldn't be your go-to all the time. So when you're engaging with a client, if you are just itching to share something about yourself so much that you're not even listening to them, that's a good message to yourself. That's not the time to self-disclose. So just shut up and listen, right? So I think it's true in every interaction. So I like that one about, you don't always have to respond. Just sit with the discomfort. If something's making, just make, you know, sit with it, understand it before you reactively jump to the other person. I had a few others in the slide. You want to go to the next one? Yeah. Oh, go to Seguin. She's multitasking over there. Crazy.
Listen, really listen, not just to prepare your response, but to hear what the other person is saying.
Listen, really, really listen. You know, oftentimes we're just nodding, but we're not really letting it sink in. Really listen. Anybody else in saying? Yeah, oh yeah, go.
You know, cut that very short because it's asking the question on the viewer background or wherever you jump in, and turn to someone else, start talking, like ignoring this person's conversation, even though you know you're not the same field, or you're not the same. This person is asking, say, okay, yeah, sure, and then you
Yeah.
the other one, because that's someone.
Yeah. Let people finish. Don't shut people off or down and go to the next person, especially if you don't like what they're saying, right? Because that's yeah.
I would say, oh yeah, you know, try to be polite and nice.
Gracias. Gracias.
That's
That-
what she said. She said, I think 2 years, 1 month. That means
As much as you talk. Love it. Love it. What would just, I'm going to be asking you in a little bit, what would Jesus say and do? But we're going to start with what does Judge Judy say, right? You got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So listen twice as much as you talk. I love it. I'm going to steal that one. I'll get your name later and I'll give you credit. Any others from Seguin? Yeah. So I do have a slide. So that, you know, I came up with some. I mean, I do this a lot. So we talked about one person speaking at a time, respecting each other's opinion. Respect doesn't mean agreement, right? I don't have to agree with you. Sometimes we just have to agree to disagree, right? But respect is essential. Remaining open-minded, that can be the hardest thing to do because all of us, like Saul, are absolutely certain, righteous in the belief that our truth is the only truth. Every single one of us, man. I want my faculty to call me Your Excellency or Your Majesty or King of the World, and they won't even call me Dean, you know. So all of us, right? All of us. So stay open-minded. You might be wrong, all of us, on some things, and right on others. Compassion. I really want us all to keep that word present. You know, compassion. See the humanity in each other. See the sacred in each other. It's always best not to assume. You know, my favorite show when I was growing up was The Odd Couple. the previous one, the old one. And that, not the new, it was a new launch, which was also pretty good. And there was a great episode where I think Felix Unger tells Oscar Madison, it's never good to assume. And he writes assume on the board. And then he circles 3 pieces of the word. When you assume, you make an ass of you and me. So it's best not to assume, but if you are going to assume, and it's natural and human to do so, always assume with the best of intentions. If you believe somebody's out to get you or hurt you, that's what you're going to see. I'm not here to convince you of anything. And I encourage each other to take that stance as well in our conversations. You're not here to convince anybody else of anything. Right? We're here to have a dialogue. And again, ask yourself, what would Judge Judy say? And what would Jesus say? How would Jesus respond? What would Jesus do? So that's good. So these are good. So I may bring us back to these at some point if things get heated. So who am I? So Pastor Katie, would you be kind enough? There, that's me. That's a picture of me. I do a lot of training on culture, and culture is rules that govern how you behave in a particular context, language and customs and foods and traditions. And when people hear the term culture, they immediately think race and ethnicity, but there's so many cultures that we belong to. Culture is an onion with layer after layer after layer. So those are some of my cultures, my group affiliations. I shared with you that I'm Catholic, wasn't born Catholic, although they baptized me Catholic. I was born Pentecostal and had 2 baptisms. So if I died as a kid, I was going to go straight to heaven. One heaven or the other, the Pentecostal heaven or the Catholic heaven. I was raised Pentecostal, going to church with my grandmother, and I hated it. So I like, one of the reasons why I remained Catholic is because I like my worship boring. I'm sorry, I just have to admit it, right? And you Lutherans, hey, you ain't the Baptist, but you're a lot more rowdy than the Catholics. So I like my tradition. I like my, So when I was 12, my adolescent rebellion wasn't to start cutting class. I was always a nerd. I wasn't smoking. I wasn't drinking. My adolescent rebellion was to become Catholic, which killed my grandmother. My grandmother actually said to me, may she rest in peace. She actually said, I would have preferred that you become a drug junkie because Jesus would have saved you from that. My sister is a Pentecostal pastor, Assemblies of God in New York City. She's still trying to convince me. Keep telling her to give it up. So when I was 12, I also come from a musical family. My family on my father's side, both my grandparents are musicians. And so I've always been a singer, and there was a parish, a church in my town that had a really good choir. And I went and practiced with them a couple of times and I liked it. And then there was this really cute girl that I liked. And I said, hey man, if I'm gonna have a shot here, I gotta become a Catholic. So I became Catholic. So it didn't work. She never knew I even existed. But I stayed Catholic, right? So Catholicism can be very tough to follow when you're in my field. And so, I've fallen out of love a little bit with Catholicism, but I'm also able to acknowledge that the church, by the way, remember that we're the only ones who can say the church, also does a lot of good stuff, right? The Catholic Church also does a lot of good stuff. So I take the good with the bad. And so you hear more and more people of faith in the US talk about being I'm culturally Jewish. I'm culturally Catholic, right? So, I think I'm somewhat religiously Catholic as well. I like ritual. I do Gregorian chant, by the way. So if you ever really want to be bored, just tell me. So we'll do Gregorian chant together. I'm a Knight of Columbus. I was a member of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. So very, very active. And what I liked about the Catholic Church was what I call the social justice, what we call the social gospel, the social gospel. So I've worked in food pantries, I do home visits, I work in immigrant ministries, and so we do a really good job in that regard. Right? The priest that I used to go to then would ruin it because he would tell us during Mass who we should go out and vote for, and it wasn't the people that were supporting the things that we were working on, right? So I had my arguments with them, but we respected each other. So that I think that service ethic, that's a value deep for me, comes from my faith, because it was instilled in me from very young that giving is how you live your faith, right? Faith without works is dead. So giving. I'm a male, and I know that whatever privilege I may lack because I am a minority male, I have it because I am a male. Right? There are people in society that are a lot less privileged than I am. You know, I may not be at the top of the totem pole, but I'm not at the bottom either. You know, because I'm male, I have certain perks. And when I talk, you know, even before I was a dean, people listen just because I'm a man, so I must know what I'm talking about, right? If only they knew. You know, men, we men know how insecure we are, and every single one of us needs to be in therapy. But, you know, but there's a sense of certainty that comes when, again, what are you going to do in this in a minute? What comes from each of these values? How do you, from each of these cultures or identities, how have they shaped you? So I think my sense of certainty comes from being a male. You know, I'm a father and a husband. You see a picture of my two Amazon women there on the right side. They call me Shorty. My wife Dernay is like 6'1". Gabrielle is already 6 feet tall, and they like heels as well. And you know, you know, fatherhood changes you. How many here are fathers or parents? You know, it changes you. You know, when I became a father late in life in my 40s, and I was still in the middle of building my career and, you know, working like a dog and thinking that work was everything. And, you know, and then, you know, you hold that kid in your arms for 3 seconds when they first arrive in the world, and everything changes. All of a sudden, all the things that you thought were important, they're not that important anymore. And you know, she's leaving me this summer, you know, and betraying me. She's going to Texas A&M. What the heck is wrong with you, kid? No. I think I pushed a little too hard for UT Austin. But you know, Gabrielle is our world, and it changes. Fatherhood changes you. It centers you. It slows you down, right? So those are things that I've learned from that particular cultural affiliation. I'm middle class, at least I think I am. You know, I was at an event a few days ago, and we were doing an exercise in identity, and somebody said, a dean that I know, and I know she lives really well, and she said, you know, I'm working class. And somebody asked her, what do you mean by that? Working class? Because, you know, we're all deans and directors and highly educated people with good salaries. And said, yeah, I don't think I could go for more than 4 or 5 months without working before being in trouble. Right? Nobody has, I mean, none of us has hundreds of thousands of dollars saved in the bank, and we could say, I don't need to work anymore, right? So she said, if I stop working in about 6 months, I'm in trouble. So I'm still working class. And so I like that definition again. But, you know, working class, middle class. I grew up very, very poor family on both sides. I was the first in my family to go to college. And I'm not poor anymore, but I'm not as not poor as I'd like to be. I'll assure you that, right? And so what I get from that upbringing is the work ethic. You know, I have three higher education degrees, a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD. I have other colleagues who ask, why do you have to work so hard? You know, didn't you go to school so you didn't have to work so hard? I don't think I work so hard, right? It's a privilege to earn a life with my mind and not with my hands. Right? If I was roofing or gardening or in agriculture, be a different story. But to me, it's not painful to work 18 hours a day. Right? It's a different kind of work, and that ethic comes from that upbringing. And so I could go on and on and on. You know, I'm a teacher, which means an educator. And to me, education is about communication, about engaging. Any of you who work in that field or know that world know that we live for what we call the aha moment. You know, you're trying to explain a difficult concept to the person you're talking to, and all of a sudden a light goes off in their minds and you see it in their face. Right, man, they got it. And you live for that moment. So that's why I try so hard to engage with people, to say things in many different ways, so that we can have that moment of connection. Educating is about connecting. So I want to do, you know, I'm a psychologist, which means I'm a good listener. I'm actually trained to listen. I had a colleague in New York that we did a lot of work together, and traveled and everything. And one day we were having coffee in New York City, another coffee next to the office. And I mentioned my girlfriend, Dernay, and my wife and I were dating at the time. She looked stunned. And I said, I'm sorry, did I say something that shocked you? And she said, you said you had a girlfriend. I said, yes. And she said, we were comfortable with each other, right? And she said, Luis, I thought you were gay up until this moment. And I said, whatever gave you that idea? And she said, because you're such a great listener. And I said, and it didn't occur to you that it could be because I'm a psychologist, right? So listening is something that comes from my training and has entered into all areas of my life. So what I'd like to do is I'd like you to, Katie, you want to go to the next one? Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like you to spend a few minutes doing this. And this is something that we're not going to do it extensively here, but I want you to at least practice it. And here's where I'm going to ask you to shake things up. Those of you in Seguin as well, shake it up, right? So I'm pretty sure if I was a betting man, I put really good money on the fact that you're sitting exactly with the people you walked in through the door with. So I'm going to ask you to get up, look around. And for today, this is never a good thing to do. But for right now, I'm going to ask you to judge a book by its cover. And I'm going to ask you to look at somebody who you think may belong to different cultures, different groups, may have different identities than the ones you have, or somebody who you know that they do, and just seek them out, sit together for a couple of minutes. And I want you to focus on these questions. So, take a minute or two each and talk about what are your various cultural affiliations, your various identities, and then pick one that you think in the moment, and this changes from moment to moment, pick one that you think has the most weight for you, the one that defines you the most. And then talk a little bit about a value or a belief or a practice that you feel comes from that group identity. And then when all of you have done that, so people in your groups of 3 or 4, when all of you have done that, you've shared a little bit about different identities that you may have. You've picked the one that you think right now in this moment defines you the most. In this moment, I don't unmute now in the church, but in this moment in time, in this moment in your life, defines you the most. One value or one belief or one practice that comes from that. And then I want you to spend the rest of the time talking about what happens when you interact with somebody who comes from a different identity, or what has happened if you have an experience to share, right? Does that make sense? So I'd like for the folks in Seguin to do the same thing. Our Zoom, that one's easy. We're going to trust the laws of mathematics and probability, and Katie's going to break them up into groups, and they'll be randomly distributed. Hopefully we won't end up with 3 white guys in one group and 3 Spanish-speaking Latinos in another. So let's do that. Let's shake it up. Let's move around. Let's get up and move around. You can have about 10 or 12 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up this segment. Buenos días. Meanwhile, the group just skipped. The Lord be with you. So they made me do it. I'll start with, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. So, that's a deceptively simple exercise. In fact, it's very, very powerful. I do it a lot. And I mean, people can just go on and on and on, peeling layers and layers. And with every conversation, every time they do it, it gets a little bit more deeper, and we take bigger risks in sharing about some of our identities that may be a little bit more difficult to talk about. So, so this is just a tease. I really want to encourage you. I'm sharing my slides and my written remarks as well, and you're glad to share them with everybody. So just continue to have these conversations. But if we can have 1 or 2 people here and maybe a couple in Seguin and somebody on Zoom, we want them to feel included, our Zoom folks. Just share something that stood out for you from the conversation. Did you learn something that you didn't know about the other person or about yourself? Or was there something that challenged you that now you want to make a commitment to go back and learn more about it? So anybody, let's start here in the room.
Yes, it's on. I feel like I learned something about the people I was with. But as you said, it's like onions, and 12 minutes together is not enough time to get to know the heart, the spirit of someone. So, yeah, it takes a lot of listening. Takes a lot of listening.
You barely scratch the surface.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, and even sharing who I am. We barely didn't hear really who Kyle was or who Susan was, her bits and pieces, those things that we think are important about ourselves, right? So really didn't even scratch the surface.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Ann. Takes time. And sometimes even, I don't know if this was your experience, but the first time I did this, even knowing where to start, because we don't really think a lot about our identities. We just live them, right? We don't really stop to think about, why do I believe what I do? Why do I behave how I do? I'm just in the middle of it every single day, and I don't stop to think about it. So maybe before we engage in this conversation again with someone else or with another group, it would be helpful to take some time reflecting on the first question. What are some of your identities and how do they shape you? Somebody else? Yes, please.
Well, I had the pleasure to meet the pastor from Victoria and Port Lavaca. And we were talking about how the identities of other cultures, like our culture, Hispanics, and I'm talking about the years I have been in this country, the way they look at me because I'm Hispanic, how much they, push you away because of my color. But they don't know who I am, where am I coming from. But these two pastors, they didn't notice my color. They just came and started talking to us and opened their arms to talk with them. And the way we look at how the expressions are, how they interact with us, it was so beautiful because they wanted to hear what we were saying. I don't think they had that much opportunity to talk to us, except to share how they are trying to bring the Hispanic community into their church. And if I had been in Port Lavaca or in Victoria, I would be very close to them because they didn't have that image, that, oh, you are Hispanic and I'm white and, we belong to different worlds. And that's something I think that we think about as Hispanics, that just because you look white, you're different than us.
Yes.
But as time goes by, living in the United States, I learned that we are the same. As a matter of fact, they had shared so much with us, my husband and I, that we are here, our church sends us, and our pastor, or senior pastor is white. Our congregation, they are all white. And they respect Hispanics, and they empower us to be part of the Lutheran Church. It doesn't matter our background. So that's what they reinforce, why I already know that we are the same. That's what
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias. Sí.
Perdón, nada más decir en español algo más. El problema muchas veces que tenemos es de que nosotros mismos nos hacemos menos.
Yes.
Sí.
Yes.
Incluso
Yes.
hay,
We undermine and minimize ourselves often.
hay pastores que no permiten que la gente hispana se acople a los americanos o a los anglos, como les queramos decir, pero el
There are
problema.
pastors that don't try to bring us together.
Yeah. Entonces, por experiencia propia, los gringos, como decimos los mexicanos, nos quieren,
Yes.
nos aman, nos aceptan.
We feel like
El
our
problema
personal
somos
experience is that the
nosotros,
gringos,
no
like we say in
no son
Mexico,
ellos, ¿verdad?
don't
Entonces,
accept us, don't
es
welcome
lo
us,
que
don't love
tenemos
us.
también que trabajar en nuestra propia cultura con la gente de nosotros, que somos iguales.
Gracias.
Nadie es mejor que nadie.
Nobody's
Todos
better than
somos,
anybody else.
como dice la palabra, imagen de Dios.
We're all made in the
Yeah.
image of God. Gracias. It's amazing how I understand him, even though we speak different language. He speaks Mexican and I speak Puerto Rican. But, you know, it's just like, believe me, there are two different languages. Exacto. Yes. It was such a joy to hear you talk about the joy of being seen as a person, right? By the people that approached your group. Not as a Latina or a Black person or a white person, not as a Republican or a Democrat, not as a straight person or as a gay person, right? And but just as a person, you know, and to come at you with open arms and to see you as an open book and just take the time to get to know who you are. So that's what I heard you say, that there was joy in being seen and treated as a person. Yeah. Gracias por compartir eso. Sí. Anybody else here before we go to our virtual folks? Yes, ma'am.
To her and him that is so important. It makes me want to cry to hear you say that, the negative part, but the positive part of the people wanting to knowing that you're the same,
Mhm.
even though, as you brought up, there's differences that we just recognize naturally as humans. And here's the problem. It just makes me so sad to hear that you were discriminated against. But I think it goes back to what he was saying
Mhm.
about how people, they just, as they're learning to think, you know, they start differentiating and they just automatically think this person is different. So to keep myself safe or just so I feel safe, that's why they differentiate.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people probably feel just as sensitive about their skin color and their cultural differences. And they want to be liked by you as much as you want to be liked by them. I think that's often the case. And I'm so glad you were open and honest with us about that.
Thank you. Mwah. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah. I actually, I love that, you know, that's, we're all equally insecure, even though we may act like we know everything. And also, I mean, I think what I get from that is that it's not all the gringos that discriminate. It's not all the Hispanics that discriminate. It's not all the African Americans or the Asians. Every group of people has people who are trying very hard to reach across and to embrace, and people who are failing at it, and people who haven't even tried yet. And so I'm an optimist. I think we can reach them all and really engage together. Yes.
The thing about it is that people that are from the very exact same culture at the same time sometimes discriminate against others in their culture.
Sure, absolutely.
Because they feel like they're not in my group. They don't, and so really, that's just as bad as when people choose to discriminate against people of other cultures.
Yes, absolutely.
We all have to get along. God, my daddy always said, God created every person on this planet and you treat them with respect
Absolutely.
until they do something that you know is not correct. And then you don't talk to them, but you don't do what they're saying because you know better.
Amen.
And I think it doesn't matter what group you are, what culture you come from, you need to learn to get along with everyone because God created them just the same as he did
Yes.
I.
Yep, absolutely. You know, what does it say? If whoever's free of sin, throw the first stone, right? I'm going to use an I statement. I can tell you that I myself, who do this for a living, I've been in therapy for 30 years, not as the therapist, as the recipient of the services. And on my worst days, I'm an equal opportunity hater. I hate everybody, right? And I have to make a conscious choice to love instead of to hate and to judge and to throw rocks. And so, yeah, it's hard work, and it's every single moment. We have to try. We have to continue to try. I want. And I know we're out of time, but I want to respect our Seguinites. Did I get that right? Seguinites, our Seguinites and our Zoomites. Anybody from Seguin, Pastor Katie, wants to share?
Lisa Deanna says that she found similarities with others in her group. And Carolyn Pfeiffer says that in her group, she was the only non-pastor, but that they were able to talk to each other and have a really good conversation. Seguin, have anyone?
That's a close written self. Yes.
Oh, gosh, now I'm on camera. Okay. I just wanted to speak a little bit on the discrimination matter real quick. I have a daughter, she's quite neurodivergent. She's also incredibly intelligent. When you first approach her, she doesn't look any different, she doesn't act any different. But once you get to the speaking to her, it becomes very clear that, you know, she has these hyperfixations and she wants to do that, and she thinks they're really, really cool. And I see people initially approach her in one way and then slowly change their opinion. And I find myself wishing that people would just continue listening to her because she's really cool. I know she's mine, but so I think what I'm saying is I think sometimes somebody looks the same as you, somebody acts the same as you. And then when you start to really get to know that person, you realize that they're not. And moving on at that point is wrong. So I just wanted to speak on that part of discrimination as well, because I think sometimes we of course see something and discriminate immediately, but then we also tend to do it once we start to know somebody as well. So
Thank you for that. Way ahead of the curve, right? Way ahead of the curve, you know, and that even when we read books by their covers, the person that's sitting next to you, worshiping with you, who looks just like you may actually not be, right? And then what changes from one moment to the next, right? It really very little, you know, when we baptize a child there at birth or an early age, and we welcome them into our community with open arms, how can we turn our backs on them later because they chose to live their lives differently from us? Right? Nothing changed. They're the same person. So, and so I think that the two points that were just made by our sibling on Zoom and our sibling in Seguin are two perfect bookends to end this first conversation, which is that there are similarities. Right, that the first person that's talked about on Zoom, what struck them the most were that immediately they found similarities with each other. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have the reality that oftentimes we may sound alike, and we may look alike, and we may appear to be very similar, but that there might be profound differences between us. And yet that doesn't really change anything. We're still the same people in the same community, and we can continue to worship together and to work hard together, even after we discover those differences, if we honor and respect those differences and choose to work around our similarities, to work together. So I have a summary slide, Pastor Katie, if you want to put it up, and just 4 or 5 bullets to kind of wrap this piece up. And Are you advancing, or was this fixed? Oh, no, wait, no. Oh, there you go. Conclusions from the first conversation. You know, fully living our faith takes effort. It's work, right? It's work like every other job you have, and you got to work at it every single moment of every single day. We are called to share each other's joys and each other's burdens. It's really there is a heavy burden sometimes in being different and wanting to keep that hidden away because you know that how people see you and interact with you is going to change. We were talking about this earlier before we even started with some siblings that I met from Cuero, which is leather in Spanish, by the way. So we are called to share each other's joys and burden. It's important that we recognize our natural tendency to mistrust. I want you to be compassionate with yourself. And when you find yourself mistrusting, discriminating, feeling like, oh, I don't want anything to do with this person, don't think of yourself as a horrible human being. You know, think of yourself as a person who's been programmed by thousands of years, and that we can't change that chip just in a couple of 100 years that we've been living together, how we've been living, right? We forget about that. Thousands of years before we got where we were. So recognize that, forgive yourselves. Let's forgive ourselves for sometimes being that person. But then here's the most important piece. Take a leap of faith and choose a different path. You can do that. We can do that. I do that every single day. I'm not joking when I say that on my worst moments, I'm an equal opportunity hater, especially when I'm driving. You should see me in the car, man. Whew. Road rage. The Valley has taken it out of me a little bit, but driving in New York City and Houston. But I take a leap of faith every single day, and I choose to see God in the other person, regardless of who they are or how they look like or what they sound like or what I think might be different about us. And that's how we move forward. So thank you so much. And I think we're going to break. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Torres. And we are on break for the next 10.5 minutes. So come back on time, no later than 11:19.
Are Seguin folks back too? Yeah, I know they'll trickle back in. Yes. I like to, I go with the flow because I'd like to think that the conversations that are happening are rich. So we're going to go into our second conversation of the day, and the way that I structured these three conversations are kind of an increasing degrees of temperature, if you will. So, and none of them are meant to be too threatening or, but as we develop rapport with each other. I was just talking with somebody who's a social worker, and I've sensed many of you know the language of psychotherapy. And so as we develop rapport with each other, we feel a little bit safer and we can take risks. So as we go through the second and third conversation, we're going to take increasing levels of risks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about parallel processes now. So as I said, I'm not a pastor. I mean, I'm not a theologian. I've been learning about Lutheran theology a lot, guided by the expert hands of Chris, as we've been exchanging notes back and forth, and he's been setting my Catholic theology right, and I've been very appreciative. I've been very appreciative of that, and then I've gone through my own process of reflection about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it, and then I went back to basics for myself, which is going to be the third conversation. But I said, why are you trying to talk about theology when you're not a theologian, right? Talk about what you know. And what I am is a psychologist and a social work educator. And we have a code of ethics that's basically our value system as a profession. So in this next conversation, what I'm going to talk about is about social work, right? The field that I've been in for 30 years. And what do social workers believe? And what do they agree on? What do we fight about? And I'm going to juxtapose that with the value system of the ELCA, which I learned about in preparation for these remarks. The internet can be a wonderful thing, could be a scary place sometimes, but I learned a lot reading about your congregation. And so I'm going to put the values side by side, and we're going to have a conversation about it. So let's go to That's my one slide for this second conversation. Is that right? Oh, yes, because the next one's just a summary slide. So a code of ethics is basically a living document that embodies what a particular culture, professions are cultures. When one of the, in the previous activity, one of the siblings that shared said, I was the only non-pastor in my group, and Bishop and I looked at each other, and at the same time we said, that's a culture too, right? So all cultures have a language, a common language. You know, the helping professions, you know, psychologists think very different from social workers, from psychiatrists, from trauma surgeons in the emergency room. You know, each have their own language, you know, their own tempo, their own way of doing things. And the code of ethics, all of these professions and many faith communities have a code of ethics as well that basically tells us as a community what we should be focused on. These are some central shared beliefs and values that should guide the work that we do, right? So I'll start with social work. And there are core values or ethical principles that are embraced by social workers throughout the profession's history and that are the foundation of the work that we do in social work and of our unique purpose and perspective. When I share my handouts and my slides, there's a link to several resources. So there they are: service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relations, integrity, and competence, right? And I don't read them every single day. I don't think about them every single day. But you know, they become part of how you do. How many of you remember when you first started driving, right? And you would go in and you would adjust the mirror and you know and you the side mirrors, the other one, and the seat, and in some models the steering wheel adjusts, and if you had a seat belt, because some of us started driving when they weren't there, you just put the seat belt on, and it was like a checklist that you went through in your mind, and sometimes even in writing. When was the last time when we did any of those things consciously? Just get into your car and you do 20 things at the same time, and then you go. Sometimes you're putting the seatbelt while going out of the driveway, right? And you adjust the mirrors once you're already on the highway. They become second nature. And the hope is that the values are going to become second nature as well. We don't have to go and look at them every single time. Sometimes we have to go and remind ourselves of them. So I'm going to read through some of the language of the social work code of ethics, and then we're going to go over to yours. So, service. Social workers' primary goal is to help people in need and to address social problems. And it goes on. It says social workers elevate service to others above self-interest. Above self-interest. Any Rotarians here? I'm a Rotary member. Service before self, right? And embodies that as well. Above self-interest. So it's like social work is like many minority communities, we're family-centered. The us is more important than the me. Social workers draw on their knowledge, values, and skills to help people in need and to address social problems. Damn, they sound like Lutherans. Social workers are encouraged to volunteer some portion of their professional skills with no expectation of significant financial return. So they all do pro bono service. Psychologists do as well. So I'm speaking of social work, but the code of ethics of psychology is very similar. The second one is social justice, right? That's when our faith becomes a little bit uncomfortable, right? When our faith is all about prayer and trying to do good and the word of the Lord, you know, we're all comfortable with it. When we try in this realm of social justice, which by definition means addressing the things that are not right, working with the folks that are not being seen or recognized, or worse, that are being outright discriminated against, or there are attempts to erase them from existence, to deny their sense of selves. So social justice. Now, in social work, this is not really uncomfortable, or should not be, by the way, but it is, because social work is also a big tent, right? There are social work programs that are very, very faith-based. I was talking with one of our siblings here who's a social worker, and she mentioned the North American Association of Christian Social Workers, NACSW. I actually went to the conference a few years ago and presented with some of our students from Houston about the field placement programs that we had developed in some faith-based settings. The presentation that the students made was phenomenal. They called it when my client is also my brother, the ethics of providing social work services in faith-based settings. It was a very powerful presentation, right? And I gotta tell you that I was really uncomfortable at times at the NACSW by what some of the people that were present were saying. And we were all social workers, and we're all bound by the same code of ethics, right? But there were some of the things that they were saying that were making me fidget in my chair, right? So again, you know, all of these people were social workers. They were all bound by this code of ethics, but they were not all the same. So it's the same phenomena in every setting that you go to. So social justice is a tough one when you blend it with faith. Social workers pursue social change, particularly with and on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed individuals and groups of people. Social workers' social change efforts are focused primarily on issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and other forms of social injustice. Right? It almost sounds like Jesus speaking, right? Send them all to me. These are the folks he wanted to work with. The activities that we do seek to promote sensitivity to and knowledge about oppression and cultural and ethnic diversity. Social workers strive to ensure access to needed information, services, and resources, equality of opportunity, and meaningful participation in decision-making for all people. And I think here it's worth stopping for a moment and reflecting on this term of equality, which doesn't necessarily mean just the same. You know, there's this concept in health in particular, but in social justice as well, about equality versus equity. And I use visuals when I present on this. I didn't include it this time, but in one of them I have a graphic of three folks that are of different heights, and they're trying to see a baseball game from the outfield. So visualize it with me. We've all seen a baseball field. So they're out in the field, standing behind the fence, trying to see the game. And there are three boxes, and each one is standing, three identical boxes of the same height, and each of them is standing on one box. Equality, the same size of box. One of them is like my wife in Amazon. Doesn't need a darn box, right? So his waist is above the fence, right? Line drive's coming, he's gonna get whacked in the forehead. You know, the other's a little shorter and just barely clears the fence. And the third one is like me, a short Puerto Rican, and even with the box can't see the game. The fence covers it. And then on the side, you have the same image, but the tall dude that doesn't need the box doesn't have one and can still see the game. The relatively taller one who only needed one box is standing on the same box that they needed. And then the vertically challenged Puerto Rican is standing on two boxes. So he can actually clear the strength-based language, vertically challenged. I didn't say short. It's two boxes so they can actually see the game, right? So that's equity. That's equity. And then I have another graph, and I want you to visualize that one as well. The exact same scenario, all three of them, but this time the fence that they're standing behind is transparent. So there's no need for boxes. That's what social workers do. Okay? Remove the root cause of the problem. The reason they couldn't see the game wasn't because of their relative heights. The reason that they couldn't see the game was because there was a barrier, right? So by replacing that barrier with something that was more porous, that could still protect them. I mean, if you've ever been in a baseball game, those line drives come at you hard and they can hurt you. So you still need a little bit of protection, but you can see the game. So the root cause is gone. And so we talk about equity and equality, immediately our defenses go up because the approach that we take to is what we call a zero-sum gain. And a zero-sum gain means that in order for you to win, I have to lose, and vice versa. In order for me to win, you have to lose. And I submit to us that we need to change that chip, and we need to get to win-win. Right? Equity and equality is about all of us winning. It's not about Latinos or brown people or Black people becoming superior to white folks, right? It's not about the Republicans being more powerful than the Democrats or the Democrats being more powerful than the Republicans. The democracy, shared governance, right? So, you know, it's not about the people who are heterosexual having all the power and our LGBTQ siblings having none, or vice versa, right? So, you know, that's those of you that follow this stuff, that's why there have been various waves of feminism. Because earlier waves of feminism were about just inverting things, replacing all the powerful men with powerful females. And then we would have the same system where my Amazon wife would be in charge of the world and I would be in a lot of trouble, right? So it's not about switching one dictator group for another. That's not what equality and equity is about. And if we can understand that, then we can move forward and we can dialogue together. Dignity and worth of the person, the third one. Social workers respect the inherent dignity of worth of the person, the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. Inherent means that it's yours to begin with. I don't give you your dignity. You have it. And in this particular context, we know that you have it because it was given by whom? By God. Not by us, not by the government, right? God gave every individual their dignity, their worth. And who are we to argue with God? Social workers treat each person in a caring and respectful fashion, mindful of individual differences and cultural and ethnic diversity. Social workers promote clients' socially responsible self-determination. They seek to enhance clients' capacities and opportunities to change and to address their own needs, right? So we work towards self-empowerment, not towards dependency. Social workers are also cognizant, and here we go, this is a lot of relevance to us. Social workers are also cognizant of their dual responsibility to the clients that they work with and to the broader society. We're doing nothing if I try to help the people that come to our agencies for service and we don't do anything to try to address the systemic roots of why they're coming to us for help, right? And what I would say to us as people of faith is we're doing nothing if we go to service on Sundays and kneel at our pews and pray for our oppressed brothers and sisters and then do nothing to change that oppression, right? Keep that in mind. I'm waiting for somebody to say, preach it, brother, amen. Yes. Don't get me started. I'm a frustrated preacher. Social workers seek to resolve conflicts between clients' interests and the broader society's interests. Clients' interests and broader society's interests in a socially responsible manner, consistent with the values, ethical principles, and ethical standards of the profession. So not just change at the individual level, change at the society level. Importance of human relationships. Social workers recognize the central importance of human relationships. They understand that relationships between and among people are an important vehicle for change. None of us can do any of the things that we do or want to do by ourselves. We need each other to do them. Social workers engage people as partners in the helping process. Here, you know what, we have to often work really hard to take out of many of our students the savior complex, right? Why do you want to go into social work? Because I want to help people. You know, I sometimes challenge students. When I was in Houston, we have grants from the Hogg Foundation to provide stipends for bilingual individuals who wanted to do a master's in social work and then go and work in Hispanic communities. There's a great need for that. And so I would do some of the interview in Spanish. They asked me to do it because they had to speak Spanish. And some people say they can speak Spanish, but after 2 sentences, they're stumped. So I always conducted half of the interview in Spanish. And invariably, ¿por qué quieres ser trabajador o trabajadora social? Why do you want to be a social worker? Oh, because I want to help people. And I said, tell me more about that. And you know, I want to help people. People help me and I want to help them. And I would even go as far as say, listen, if you want to help people, you could go to Walmart and work as a greeter. Welcome them, help them get their cards, helping, help old little ladies, bring the bags to their car. So social work is hard. It's really hard. You know what most people say in every discipline when they're trying to say that something really isn't that hard? They say, hey, it's not rocket scientists. It's not rocket science, right? You've heard the expression, right? You know what rocket scientists say when they're trying to say that something's not that hard? It ain't social work. This is really hard work, internally and outwardly. Social workers seek to strengthen relationships among people in a purposeful effort to promote, restore, maintain, and enhance the well-being of individuals, families, social groups, organizations, and communities. Well-being, not just health, not just mental health, but well-being, which by definition is holistic. The body, the mind, the soul, the communities that you live in. Integrity. Social workers behave in a trustworthy manner. That is really critical to our profession. And we fight really, really hard for the public to actually respect the profession. Because if they don't, people don't come to us, right? Social workers are continually aware of the profession's mission, values, ethical principles, and ethical standards, and practice in a manner consistent with them. Social workers take measures to care for themselves professionally and personally. We're terrible at it, but we talk about self-care all the time. And I suspect that the people of the cloth are the same way, right? Self-care, but we give until it hurts. Social workers should take measures to care for themselves professionally and personally. Again, self-care. Social workers act honestly and responsibly and promote ethical practices on the part of the organizations with which they're affiliated. So not only do they act ethically and in a principled manner, but they push the organizations where they work to do the same. And sometimes that means walking out. Sometimes that means protesting. Sometimes that means quitting. Sometimes that means getting fired, right? And many people do. So, because they can't just take what the agency is doing. The agency is acting unethically. And people, they have a license to uphold, but more than the license, they have ethics to uphold. And I think that that's a lesson for us as well. How many of us are worshiping in congregations where many of our siblings are not welcome? That is my experience. That is my experience. I have a picture which I posted on Facebook many years ago in my parish, a parish where I worshiped for 12 years. And at some point I was spending more time there than at home. As I shared with you, I was in the choir. I was a cantor in masses that didn't have a music choir. I was the cantor. I was part of the Gregorian chant group. I'm Knight of Columbus, Society of St. Vincent de Paul, did home visits with folks that requested financial assistance, supervised students that were placed there through the field placement that I developed, and on and on and on. Pastor High was my pastor at the time. It was wonderful. He's no longer there. I used to tell Pastor, you got to have to put me on the payroll because, I'm spending more time here than I do at home. And it was a lot of work. And it was a lot of work for me to continue to do that because I knew that there were some people in that congregation that I considered my siblings, that I worshiped with, that I sang with in choir, that I spent countless hours with. If you're in the music ministry, you know that when you're preparing for the whole period of Advent, the whole period of Lent, it's nonstop, right? And so these were people that I embraced and loved as my fellow Christians, my fellow Catholics, and suddenly I would hear something come out of their mouths that I would be like, what? You're talking about me. You're talking about my niece. And so it was really hard not to walk out. Would have been easy to walk out and say the hell with you, right? The picture that I had that I started to tell you about was in the bathroom, in the men's bathroom. Somebody wrote in beautiful penmanship on the back above the toilet, being gay is not a sin. And I remember I went to the restroom that morning during mass and took that picture. Then I went home, I posted it on my Facebook page with some reflections about the incredible pain that whoever wrote that had to be feeling, being there because they were there. They were part of the congregation, but hiding who they were and listening to their way of life being attacked and chastised again and again by the people who came to preach or by other siblings in the church. And yet they were still there and they were still in pain. And then I would ask myself, what can I do about that? So I challenged people and I had conversations and I got hate mail and I got threatened with being kicked out of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. There was a group of fellow Vincentians who wanted me kicked out at one point because I shared, I blended my professional and my faith values, and we were having a conference at the College of Social Work at the U of H, and one of the guest speakers was Jessica Farrar. I don't know if some of you remember Jessica Farrar, who used to be in the legislature and was a big advocate for reproductive rights. And that wasn't the topic that she was talking to talk about, by the way. She was talking about how do we get more Latinos in positions of power and decision-making position. But all that my fellow Vincentians could see was that I was promoting an event where Jessica Farrar was going to be a speaker. And then, oh, sin of sins, I had the audacity of sharing the flyer with all of them and inviting them to come. Oh, they tried to get me kicked out because I was friends with a baby killer and I would, what kind of Catholic was I, and on and on and on. And it was easy for me to fight back, but I didn't. I just took it, I turned the other cheek, not the way they wanted me to. I hit back, but I hit back with facts and with information and with education. And eventually I kind of won them over. None of them went to the event, but they stopped calling for my head, right? But I had to do that, right? Because my value system says that if the organization I'm in is working in an unethical way, in a way that challenges my professional values, I'm called to do something. And so I try to do something. And then the last one is competence. And competence is about doing what you do well, being good at what you do. Social workers practice within their areas of competence and develop and enhance their professional expertise. Social workers continually strive to increase their professional knowledge and their skills and to apply them in practice. What I was saying earlier about how faith requires work, right? So as people of faith, we also have to work continuously at honing our skills, at perfecting our craft. Social workers should aspire to contribute to the knowledge base of the profession, right? So social workers are expected to publish and go to conferences and disseminate the work that they do. There is equivalency here as well. So those are the values of the profession of social work. So then I started looking, okay, so what are the values of the ELCA? And I was like, darn, these people are social workers, right? So they're there on the right. So forgiveness and reconciliation, dignity, compassion, and justice, inclusion and diversity, courage and openness to change, faithful stewardship of God's creation and gifts. So I want to talk about them a little bit, but I want you to do a lot of the talking. So I'm not the Lutheran, I'm not the theologian. So I'm just going to highlight some of the passages that struck me to my core, that felt really, really relevant to the work that we all do and need to do more of. And I want you to share a little bit about how you live that value here and in Seguin and on Zoom. So I was reading, and the document that you have says, our values are grounded in faith, in our biblical and Lutheran confessional sources, and our love of God and neighbor. They speak to the way that this church lives and practices our faith, and they'll guide how we journey forward in Christ as church together. And then the first one, forgiveness and reconciliation. And there were a couple of passages. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. You know them better than I do. But things that struck me. We are reconciled to God by God's forgiving mercy. As a people of God, we embody forgiveness in speech, action, and relationships. And our ministry and reconciliation is foundational. How do we live that? Can I get somebody to share briefly how you live that? Forgiveness and reconciliation as a core. It's the first one listed, so it's an important value. We're reconciled to God by God's forgiving mercy. Forgiveness and reconciliation flow from what God has made us to be in Jesus Christ and what God is doing with us in the world. As a people of God, we embody forgiveness in speech, action, and relationships. And our ministry in reconciliation is foundational. Anybody want to share how you live that or how you struggle to live that? Hey, even more, if you're struggling with it, I want to hear about it even more. Por favor. We have one up and one. Sí. Yes, I'll translate. Inglés o español, doesn't matter.
Mi nombre es Natanael Lizarazo
My name is
y
Nathaniel.
cuando hablo inglés, lo primero que se detecta es que inglés es mi segundo lenguaje.
When I speak English, the
Eh.
first thing that you pick up is that it's my second language.
En
Hey,
la,
but you speak two languages,
Yes.
Nathaniel.
Amen.
That's a strength.
En la ecología de nuestra ELCA, soy un pastor de color o aquel que su idioma primario no es el inglés.
In the ecology of our
Sí.
ELCA, I'm a pastor of color and one whose primary language is
Y-
other than English.
Yo realmente nací en el ministerio de la ELCA cuando la ELCA nació, el mismo año, en 1988.
I was born into the ELCA ministry the same year that the ELCA was born, 1988,
88.
1988.
Y nuestro primer ministerio con mi esposa fue sirviendo la gente hermosa, generosa, espiritual de Pine Ridge Indian Reservation.
My first ministry with my wife was serving the beautiful, generous, wonderful people of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation
En South Dakota.
in South Dakota.
Y nuestra congregación era todo el sínodo de Dakota del Sur.
And our congregation was the entire synod of South Dakota.
Seeking to bring to life forgiveness and reconciliation and learning. And here is where I'm going to confess my struggle. Because it's a real struggle as a pastor of the ELCA. One is to have it in the paper
And writing.
and to have the statements. And that indeed is very important to have it because it gives us a kind of a launching platform. But another is to live it. And so my struggle, and only by the grace of God, it is, Nathanael, you have repeated these million times in conversations and coffee and worship and workshops, inviting your siblings to come along to a kind of the mission of God, not our own, and yet all the time facing resistance, sometimes wide open, and some other times kind of more under the table, but resistance is there. And so now that I'm retired, and most of our 35 years have been in cross-cultural settings or in global settings. Both my wife and I have come to this conclusion that do whatever you can do. Don't be silent where you need to speak out. But at the end of the day, even if people do not come or show resistance or everything, love them anyway. Love them anyway. Pray for them. And most importantly, try to keep a bridge of some communication and some relationship, because we never know when God is going to use an experience, an event, and to go for that. So I was kind of deeply interested in these conversations, and we are getting there now with this. I was asking here, yes, wonderful to have it in paper, but unless it becomes like habits, let's say habits of the heart, in our daily relationships, Dennis. But I think that we are making a progress.
We are, yes, we are.
In our ecology as of ELCA. Sometimes gently pushed by the Spirit, some other times really violently pushed by the Spirit. You go there or not. So thank you for this opportunity to somehow bring my voice.
Thank you.
The
Thank
heavy
you,
accent of a pastor of color to the conversation.
Gracias, gracias. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Yes. You are making progress, right? You're making progress. You know, we Catholics may be the ones going to heaven, but you guys are way miles ahead of us. Miles ahead of us. Yes. It's even harder to have these conversations in my setting. For forgiveness and reconciliation. South Dakota, right? A native reservation. Talk about, I was sharing this morning that I loved the land acknowledgement statement, and that I wish that our UTRGV had one, but the UT system doesn't have one, right? Because none of us were here first, right? We're all immigrants, you know, but people of color, I always chuckle when people of color, because last time I checked, white was a color too. So, you know, we're all people of color. And then last night, Pastor Ruben was talking when we were having the conversations about minority communities, and made a comment about how minorities ain't minorities anymore, by the way. You know, they're more when you add up the black, the brown, the Asian, the natives, we're more than 50% of the population. So in fact, in my academic circles, we've stopped using the term minority communities, and we started using the term minoritized, right? Those that are continuing, that are struggling with the fact that we're seeing a radical demographic change in our society, are insisting on minoritizing these communities, even though they're no longer the minority communities. And just wait, best is wait to come. Puerto Ricans reproduce like rabbits, man. You know, there's like 55 million Mexicans and 6 million Puerto Ricans, but we're gonna catch up. We're gonna catch up, right? So, yeah. You know, the other thing that struck me as Nathaniel was talking is about the two dimensions of forgiveness. Forgiveness is about forgiving as well as it is about asking for forgiveness, right? So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Any Pastor Katie, anybody on the Zoom or in Seguin yet? Okay. So anybody else who wants to share before I move to the next one? How do you live with it? How do you struggle with it? And articulating that, by the way, is really important, because it keeps that conversation moving. In Puerto Rico, my mother used to say when I was growing up, el papel aguanta lo que le pongas. The paper will withstand whatever the heck you put on it. So it's, you know, it sounds beautiful on paper. It even sounds beautiful when you read. I mean, it is soaring rhetoric. It gives you goosebumps when you read it. But how difficult it is to live it, Anybody else want to share here how you live it, or how you struggle with it, or how you would like to see it lived? You would like us to live it more authentically. Bishop?
So one of the things I struggle with in our synod is we have had and continue to have congregations that choose to leave the ELCA, but they don't want to talk about it with us. So there's not really an opportunity to engage so that we could have forgiveness and reconciliation. And that's an ongoing struggle. So sort of how do you reconcile that with our faith that calls us to be reconciled?
Yeah, the line in the sand syndrome. I'm going to talk a little about lines in the sand in the third conversation. But that's the attitude that says, if you ain't going to do it the way I do it, I'm out of here, right? I'm out of here. And we've seen in the history of the church, the entire church in the last 2,000 plus years, how many fragmentations and divisions we've had. And I think we've seen some light. There are lots of efforts at ecumenical efforts and rapprochement and reconciliation between various denominations and at least worshiping together, working together. It's a beautiful thing to watch, but and to be a part of. But there are still others that are digging in their heels and no, you're going to hell and I'm going to heaven and I'm going to stay where I am. So yes, it's an ongoing, and that's the fear of opening up the conversation, right? Because we don't want to push people away. So that's why I said this morning when I started, my hope is that the God will soften our hearts, that even if I can't move you an inch in the other direction, and when I talk about that, I don't just mean you coming to my side because of my values and my professional persona and my chosen work. I'm a pretty progressive doer and thinker. There's some areas where I'm very conservative, by the way. But that's my business. It's not my client's business, right? I can still recognize the inherent dignity and worth in you, even if you live your life different from me. And I recognize that as a progressive thinker on many things, sometimes it's really hard for me to take a step in the other direction. It's easy for me to say, hey, come over here, right? I have the high road. I know that I have the moral truth, the certainty, the absolute certainty that my way is the right way. Why won't you come in this direction? And there's just as much value as me saying to myself, can I move a little bit in that direction? Can I try to see the world through the eyes of the other person and understand, not agree with, understand why they choose to live the way they do, why they choose to do the things they do, right? Now, when they're hurting people that I care for, I got to be a little bit more forceful. So when we march and we protest and we're outspoken and when it gets to that point, at some point, it comes to saying, I don't care if you leave. I don't want you to leave. We can still work together, even if we never agree on certain things. But I won't let you keep hurting people as long as you're here, right? That's ethical behavior. That's the higher calling, and that's really hard to do. It relates to the next one as well. I mean, really, I'm not kidding. I thought, damn, who wrote this? You guys have social work spies in the ALCA that, dignity, compassion, and justice. Look at the second and third bullet under social work. Social justice, dignity and worth of the person. Dignity, compassion, and justice. This is your code of ethics. Each person is created in God's image. As Pastor Nathaniel was saying, it looks beautiful on paper, but do we live that way? Do we live that belief? We respect this God-given right to dignity, God-given right to dignity. And inspired by the life of Jesus, we show love and compassion for all people. Through the proclamation of the gospel, through worship, and as servants of God working for healing and justice in the world, we uphold and seek to protect the dignity and human rights of all people. That is some powerful rhetoric. How do we live it? How do we struggle to live it? How could we live it more fully? Anybody want to share? Again, you can share about how you're trying to do it, how you're struggling to do it, or how you wish we could do it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm a pastor that has 4 ecosystems surrounding her church. I have the criminal element, my baggers, my taggers, my gang members who B&E, break and enter and assault people and, break windows. Then I have the second community, which is my unhoused community, my homeless community that need food, need clothing, at times need a gift card to buy toiletries, so on and so forth. Then I have a business community that actually donates money because they use our premises for daycare and AA meetings and NA meetings, and we charge them a small donation and they pay it. And several of the organizations actually keep the roof on our building paid for. And with our congregation dwindling, we can still keep our doors open. And then I have the ELCA, the church that has about 35 people coming in and out of its doors 40 hours a month, which means that's about 10 hours a week. So I struggle with not necessarily promoting that we're a church, but attracting that we're a church, attracting people to understand that we're going to serve the marginalized and those who are without. But the people who come on Sundays drive 45, 50 minutes away from where they live to where we are located, which means that over some years, they decided to move away closer to where it's more economically sound or to get away from the other, or because they could afford it, or their children grew up in the church and now they're no longer going to the church. So now they can make decisions to move to other places. But they're coming because of tradition and because they love the church, but the pastor is different. The community around it has changed and they're making decisions because they're all over 60, whether to keep driving that far or not. So I'm creating, re-envisioning, reimagining, rebranding a new church. But I'm struggling with trying to make the hours of usage of the building be more for the church than it is for these other agencies and there you go. Because they use what we are supposedly representing more than what we are.
Yeah.
So as a pastor, I am challenged. That's why I'm bilingual pastor. A bilingual pastor is starting to just have bilingual services, not just English services, bar none, to attract the biracial child who has Spanish as in their heritage, but doesn't know how to speak Spanish. And the child who goes to an English speaking school that won't let them speak their Spanish, but their abuela and abuelita live in their home with them and they're mad because they won't speak Spanish. And then of course, the migrant and immigrant community that lives around me that's coming from all over the South American borders who really are probably just more energized about having faith in believing that God is real than most of us who have been Christians for a number of years, who really need to be grounded and founded in a church and have a pastor that can lead them to help them read, write, and speak not only their own language, because some of them are coming with 3rd, 4th grade education, not even a level of speaking level that we've considered acceptable in American schools, but to teach them the alphabet and to teach them the Lord's Prayer at the same time in a bilingual setting that makes them comfortable. It's really easy work.
Yeah.
But God's doing it. I'm just the vessel. So I am challenged with the dignity part. How do I keep them coming with feeling accepted? I'm challenged with them feeling inclusive because their language barriers is just one of those things. But being incorporated in a community that have those 4 ecosystems and to believe that they're accepted, well, that's a God thing too.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. And thank you for that word. Yeah. Go ahead, Pastor Kate. It's insane.
So, yeah, sorry. As we've been having this discussion, I've been thinking about how when my house is super, super dirty and really needs to be cleaned, it is really hard for me to get started on that, to even just start with the first task, because I look at it and it feels so overwhelming that I don't even know where to begin. I think we can all agree that there is a disconnect between our stated values on paper and the way that we try to live those out in our congregations, in our communities, our families. And I think when we look at that disconnect, we can be so overwhelmed by what is in it that we don't even know where to start. And so we just ignore it like I do in my house. But ignoring it, as I have learned, does not actually solve the problem. It only gets worse. So I think there is something to be said for really examining where that disconnect lies between stated values and how we live those out, and then wrestling with that. So I'm glad that we are here and having these conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Anybody on Zoom? Yeah. Yeah, you know, upholding and seeking to protect the dignity and human rights of all people is relatively easy when we're thinking about people who are just like us, right? Like I've said multiple times and will continue to say, when they look like me, when they sound like me, when they live like me, when they pray like me, when I think they're like me, even though there are many important ways in which they may not be, this is easy. It gets harder when I start to realize that there are many ways in which we're not the same. And some of it is, some of that difficulty comes, we talked about this in one of the conversations that I was having today. Some of it becomes from our tendency to dig our heels in the sand. Oh, I'm right. Some of it comes from our certainty about things we were taught about our faith early on. Once somebody's been trained, it's really hard to retrain them. And in many of our faith traditions, was raised Pentecostal, you know, the God that I was taught was the God of the Old Testament, a God of brimstone and fire who was pissed off at you if you didn't do A, B, and C. There must be like 70,000 rules in the Old Testament that are impossible to keep up with, you know, some of them contradictory, but we cherry pick, right? We pick and choose the ones that we want to utilize to live in the certainty that we are correct in condemning behavior X or behavior Y. But, you know, there's plenty of passages in the Old Testament about lying and deceiving our spouse to steal a blessing for another child, or daughters sleeping with their fathers, getting them drunk and then sneaking into their room, and you know, murderous behavior. And you know, the Old Testament would be the ultimate novela, the soap opera. But we go there, right? That's, you know, oh, no, because the Bible says, yes. And many conversations and many slaps with my grandmother when I finally found the courage to talk back, but in a respectful way, to engage in conversation, because that's always been my approach. And it gets harder. Inclusion and diversity. As Christ Church, we value the richness of God's creation and offer a radical welcome. That is one of the most powerful phrases in that entire document. A radical welcome to all people, appreciating our common humanity and our differences. Appreciating our common humanity and our differences. We are a church that does not view diversity as a barrier to unity. We recognize and will challenge the dynamics of power and privilege that create barriers to participation and equity in this church and in society for women, people of color, minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, people who are marginalized or living in poverty, and the LGBTQ plus community. It's right there. It's right there. So again, please, how do you live it? How do you struggle with it? How do you wish we would live it? What can we do? And we have about 7 minutes, Pastor. We're gonna stop at 12:19. Is that, or did you want me to shut up earlier? You tell me, you're the boss. You tell me what to do. Listen, I was raised Catholic. I told you, you know, and then, you know, when I look at the person with the collar, they're talking on behalf of God. So you tell me to shut up, I shut up. I know, but yeah, I've been programmed that way. Changing the chip is very difficult. Does anybody want to share one or two remarks? One or two remarks about how, I mean, this one's one of the hardest. This is the line in the sand for many people. The last time there was a divorce was over this issue, right? Yeah. Yes.
I made the comment back to the piece of paper of all of it. It's like, oh, yeah, it might say that on paper, but our lived reality is not that.
Yeah.
And you know, Pastor Leah's remarks probably hit home to people all over the synod. You know, is that us? And as we go back to the first one with the forgiveness and reconciliation, and that again, I struggle with, we say this and I say I believe this, and then not only do I fall short and struggle with accepting forgiveness for myself, right? Even though I say, oh, for you, and there's grace and for everyone else, but then struggle with the people who say, I ascribe to this, and then act in ways that don't do that. And then now I'm supposed to forgive and be reconciled to them too. And that's really hard. Like, you know, or culturally the same thing, right? Where I say, this is who I am and what I believe. And then the lived reality is so different. And how do I forgive them?
Yes. The Ananias in us says, you want me to do what? You want me to embrace who? You want me to love who? I don't care if it's written there. Yes, yes. The struggle is real. And it's not just here, it's in many other places. Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, the big thing is sincerity in that inclusion and diversity, that we're doing more than just checking a box, right? That we're doing more and we're reaching out to be inclusive, yes, but to be fully engaged in that inclusivity as well. And one of my struggles with that is sometimes I find myself going through and checking the box. You know, it's I attended Sunday worship. Hey, great. You know, I was inclusive and kind to my neighbor. Hey, great. Well, yeah, but did I spend the time needed to get to know? Okay. Did I spend the time needed to, because my dad told me years ago, son, your responsibility to me is not to agree with me, but it's to keep your mouth shut and just listen. And then my responsibility to you is likewise, is to listen. And then once we get to that point, then we can start having real fruitful dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. I'll add to that the courage to make mistakes and to move on from those mistakes, learn from them. Earlier this morning, I referred to Pastor Katie by the wrong pronoun, right? And I didn't stop myself and castigate myself and, oh Lord, I'm going to go to heaven, and or I'm going to go to hell, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It was a slip. It's, you know, we all make mistakes, and we all keep learning about all of this, right? You know, it's work. I go back to the piece about how honing our craft, perfecting our skill is work. I live and work in a community that's 94% Hispanic. You know, I've been teaching in the Valley for 3 years, and it's been very rare to have a student in my class who's not Latino. Right now, I'm teaching an undergraduate research methods class, and I have 21 students, every single one of them female, every single one of them Hispanic. And so we've talked about, I'm going to teach them research methods, but I'm not going to miss this opportunity to talk about everything else. So we've talked about how homogeneous this group is, and what does that mean? And as social workers, are you only going to work with Latino clients? What's going to happen when you work with an African American or an Asian client or a Native American client when you haven't met one in the course of being here? They're there. They may not be in your class right now, but they're at UTRGV. And so, because it's a research class, I frame it as research, and I gave them research to do every semester. I said, you know, you have a homework, and I'm going to give you extra credit for that. But you're going to have to tell me where you went and what you did. So one of them is, you know, go to an ethnic restaurant to eat other than Mexican, right? Man, I love Mexican food, but right there in the Bible, it says men does not live by Mexican food alone. Oh, and so what, look it up, it's there, I swear, no. You know, so I went, I had tacos, or I had quesadillas, or I had enchiladas, and so, and I give him list of I give him list of Indian restaurants, Middle Eastern restaurants, Italian restaurants, Filipino restaurants, right? And the homework is to go by yourself or with somebody else and try something you've never tried before, even if you hate it. And then you're gonna come back and you're gonna report on what that experience was. Right? You're gonna get extra credit. You tell me the restaurant, you're gonna tell me what you ordered, and you're gonna share what the experience was like. You know, I start with that one. That one's easy. Then I give them another assignment. I say, I want you to go out on campus, approach somebody that looks different from you. We have Black students at UTRGV. We have Asian students at UTRGV. Approach them and chat with them, right? And you know, these are most of them are young folks, and they're really progressive thinkers. They're what the other side likes to call woke, you know, and want them to go back to sleep, right? So you know, getting them to engage with the LGBTQ plus community is not that hard in that context. But you know, getting them to engage with somebody who's not Mexican and doesn't eat Mexican food. But I start there, right? And they come back and they talk about it, and invariably, whether they liked it or didn't like it, whether they plan to do it again or not, the answer is, you know, that wasn't so hard. I actually enjoyed that, doing something differently. I actually enjoyed meeting somebody different, learning that we're not that different. Invariably, that's one of the things that comes from that conversation. You know, I realize we're not that different. We like the same things. We even watch the same TV shows. We eat the same foods, right? But it takes courage to do that, which is the next one, Pastor Katie. We're almost at the end. It takes courage and openness to change. I'm going to wrap us up in the second conversation. And again, these are teases. It is my hope that you'll continue to have these conversations with yourselves and with each other in your congregations. Courage and openness to change. Could you go back to the previous one? I want to finish the last two values. There you go. No, yeah. Courage and openness to change. These are your code of ethics, because we trust in God's promise and understand faith to be a living, daring confidence in God's grace. We're emboldened to embrace learning and to change our spiritual and institutional journey as church. This means we're open to new ways. I asked all of you to be open-minded, open to new ways, and willing to take risks to discover God's plan for this church. You already have the blueprint to do this work. The trick is, how do you make it part of your lived experience, like you were saying? And last but not least, faithful stewardship of God's creation and gifts. As church together, faithful stewardship is about holding to God's purpose and ensuring the responsibilities and resources that God has entrusted to us are used with great care and with great accountability to God, to each other, and to those who are served by the church. Served by the church. We are a sanctuary, not a social club, right? And if we can understand that, we can live these values. You want to go to the last one, Pastor Katie? Thank you. So there it is. We have a roadmap. We have tools. Sometimes you say, I don't even know where to start. It's right there in black and white. Your code of ethics. We just have to find the courage to do it, to live our values, to focus on our shared humanity and faith and not on what divides us. And again, like I wrapped up the previous conversation, to make a choice, take a leap of faith and choose to trust that God always has a plan, that He made all of us, and that God doesn't make mistakes. Thank you and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you again, Dr. Luis. That was wonderful. We are going to break into our respective communities for lunch, and we'll get some lunch instructions. We're going to come back here promptly at 1 p.m. But let's have a lunch prayer. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this rich food of conversation that we've had this morning. And we thank you for the lunch that we are about to have and the conversations that will continue. We ask that you would use all of these things to strengthen us, to give us the courage to be the people that you have called and empowered us to be. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, see you back at 1. Lunch instructions by site. Oh, go left. People go left. The time is near. Right.
Yeah, we're going to start with our music. Come on back and we will begin with our music. So they're waiting on us. People.
Thank you so much for your patience with our technology glitches every now and then and being in many places at the same time. It's a wonderful experiment that we're doing, although we know there's no substitute for the human touch. So if our Seguin siblings will have me, I'll come out and visit with you over there. So I don't think I've ever been to Seguin. I've driven by on my way to, Wayne Country. So good. So the third conversation is really less of a conversation. It's really going to be more of a monologue, and the conversation will come afterwards because it's going to flow into a panel. And I've called it Back to Basics. This third conversation is maybe the toughest one, but at the same time, I propose to you that it's also the easiest one if we maintain an open mind. And I want to humbly ask you to look back on our agreements this morning and retain an open mind. It is my intention to open dialogue and to help us find together a path forward in engagement and in more fully living our faith values, making those things that we were reading in the previous conversation our lived experience every day. And I'm going to center my comments on what I call going back to basics. And we're Christians of different flavors. So for us, going back to basics naturally means revisiting the life of Christ. What can we learn from Jesus Christ, the man and the God, that can help us navigate the very tricky waters that we're navigating these days? What did Jesus believe? What did he do? Who did he minister to? Before we reflect on that, let's name a huge elephant in the room. Let's acknowledge that our society is in a very vulnerable place right now. We've always been a diverse society, but for generations, we seem to live our lives according to the motto, live and let live, especially in hardy places like Texas. Lately, however, there are these voices, already loud voices that have become even more amplified with the 24-hour news cycle and with social media on all sides of all issues, not just on one side. The loud voices are on all sides of all issues. And those voices are telling us how to think, what issues we should support, who we should oppose, who we should vote for, how we should live our lives. The news is no longer the news. It's become entertainment, not even infotainment, entertainment. I'm old enough, I'm knocking on 60, to remember when the news was just the facts, and I was left to use my own critical thinking to decide what I thought about it, right? I used to admire folks like Peter Jennings, Barbara Walters. Some of you may remember these people. Dan Rather, Connie Chung, Walter Cronkite, even Soledad O'Brien, who's not that old. I used to think that if the world was ending, I wanted to hear it from Peter Jennings, right? Peter Jennings, right? Peter Jennings was like, I like my worship, boring. He was just giving you the facts, right? He was just giving you the facts. Now, the news is facts plus analysis plus indoctrination plus a whole lot of entertainment and selling us stuff, literally with product placement and endless ads to keep us from thinking. That's the purpose, to keep us from thinking. News outlets are tailored to specific ideologies so that I don't even have to bother to think. If I believe or vote in a certain way, there's a set of channels that I'm going to watch. And if I believe and think or vote in a different way, I'm going to watch a whole other set of channels. And I don't even have to tell you what those channels are. You know them well. Programmed by all of this, instead of reaching out and embracing each other and sitting down to dialogue with each other and to get to know each other, we're constantly yelling at each other, judging each other, fighting each other, trying to erase each other from existence. With so many diverging ideological perspectives, so many lines in the sand, how can we approach hot topics with sensitivity and compassion? How do we access practical tools for civil debate and for Christian love across whatever divide, whatever chasm we're looking at each other from? How do we acknowledge that, meanwhile, we are still members of one community of faith and that we very much want to remain that way? I submit to you that the answer, the path forward, is going back to basics. What do the Gospels in particular teach us about loving and about not judging the other, the stranger, the neighbor, even the enemy? Can love be the link that brings us together, keeps us together, and lets us build a better community? Can it really be that simple? Our Lutheran siblings in the Florida Bahama Synod have called their anti-racist campaign Just Love. And I love to talk about it, right? I think Bishop Pedro had this inspired idea when he convened the task force. He said, I give you one job, right? I don't want you to use the terms anti-racist, because those kinds of terms immediately put us on edge, defensive, right? You know, immediately the sense is somebody's on the right side of that one and on the wrong side of that one. And while that may be true, if you give in to that initial knee-jerk reaction, the dialogue ends there. And they came up themselves with this term, just love, a beautiful play of words. Just love, referring to just loving each other, but also just love in terms of going back to a love that is just, centered in justice, like the love that Jesus showed for his fellow human beings and continues to show for us today, despite how imperfect we all are. We know that we all have something that would be the cause for Jesus casting us out, and yet he still embraces and loves us. So what can the values of the social work profession, our own Christian and ELCA values, and the life of Jesus teach us about compassion, service, and love? Let's go back to basics. Let's take a look at the life of Jesus. The Gospels tell us that Jesus ministered to and healed many people during his brief time of service, traveling extensively, preaching, and teaching the good news of God's love and salvation. His ministry was marked by his compassion for the sick, the oppressed, and the marginalized, the same people that the Social Work Code of Ethics and the ELCA Code of Ethics are talking about. And he spent most of his time, much of it, sharing his gifts with those in need. And one of his gifts was healing. As a healer of physical ailments, the gospel record many examples of Jesus healing people with leprosy, blindness, deafness, and paralysis. Physical illnesses that even today, if left untreated, can lead to lives of pain and isolation. In the time of Jesus, many of these conditions were poorly understood, and people who suffered from them were marginalized, ostracized, cast out of society. So by healing them, and here is an important lesson, by healing them, Jesus wasn't just alleviating their physical pain. He was creating a path for them to reintegrate more fully into their communities. He was restoring, or rather recognizing, their inherent dignity. That's what we must focus our energies on as members of communities where so many are marginalized. Recognizing their inherent dignity, their divinity, and working to integrate them fully into our communities. not pointing fingers and making them feel uncomfortable and wishing that they'd go somewhere else. Jesus also ministered to people's emotional and spiritual needs, showing compassion to those who were grieving or lonely, offering hope to those in despair. He taught about God's love and forgiveness. He taught us that emotional pain is also something that we need to attend to in ourselves and in others. Many of our minority or minoritized communities share a value that we call in Spanish fatalismo, fatalism. This is the cross that God sent me and I just have to carry it. There's no sense in trying to change it, right? What am I to do? What can I do? It's akin to the stiff upper lip of more mainstream communities, right? The attitude that says, what's the sense? God wants me to suffer, or this is my cross to carry, as I just said, or we don't ask for help, or even worse, we don't need help. Those attitudes run counter to what Jesus taught us because he healed. And by healing, taught us that healing was acceptable. You could argue convincingly that Jesus was an equal opportunity Lutheran social worker. He was a Jew at a time when people stuck to their own groups, and yet his ministry wasn't limited to a particular group of people. He ministered to both Jews and Gentiles. He welcomed all who came to him. He did more than welcome. He didn't just wait for them to come to him. He reached out to those who were considered outcasts by society, tax collectors, prostitutes, the poor. Jesus also ministered to people of different social classes. Here too is a lesson for us, including people who were wealthy and powerful, and was criticized for that. There's no shame in wealth or judgment for the wealthy, especially when it comes from people's hard work. Indeed, one of the things that I struggle to get many of our social workers in training to understand is that doing good and doing well are not mutually exclusive. What we must remember, however, is that Luke says, to whom much is given, much will be required, so that we are held responsible for what we have, our talents, our wealth, our knowledge, our time, and we must use these not just to enjoy the fruits of our hard labor and have a good time, but we should do that, but also to benefit others. The life of Jesus, a life that we all strive to emulate, and we all fall short emulating, was characterized by his compassion and love for all people, regardless of their social status or their background or how they live their lives. He didn't stop to interview them and see, are you like me? He healed them. How does this help us become better Christians, better Lutherans, better people? We are one community made up of many different peoples, and we don't all march in lockstep. We don't all believe the same things, even within the walls of our houses of faith, let alone within the walls of our own homes. We don't all surround ourselves with the same people or the same kind of friends. We don't all vote for the same candidates or support the same legislation. We don't all love in the same way. How do we embrace each other and not judge each other? As I've said many times already, it's harder to love my sibling when they're not like me. How do we navigate our differences and still remain one community? We must try to answer these questions by going back to basics. And for us, that means by following the example that Jesus laid out for us, crystal clear. Now, let's not kid ourselves. Just like the code of ethics, it's easy to say this, it's hard to do it. The struggle to reconcile all of this within us is real. No matter where we come from and how much Christian love there is in our hearts, there is difficulty in reaching across and embracing the other. And as I've said multiple times, that's true for those of us on both sides of the issue. I would love it if everybody came to my side. And I recognize also how hard it is for me to move even an inch in the other direction. We both have to try. We are all one, and yet we are all different. How do we acknowledge that and go forward together? The key, I believe, is to understand and accept that we can disagree with one another without questioning the humanity and the divinity in each other. And there is humanity and sacredness within all of us. Even in that, we are like Jesus. Meanwhile, which Paul do you want to be like? Do we want to be like Paul the tormentor or Paul the healer? Anchored in a self-righteousness that was the size of Texas, Paul was a persecutor, a tormentor, an exterminator of Christians. Let us remember that he was headed to Damascus with a letter from the high priest to round up all the Christians and get rid of them. Bring them to Jerusalem was a euphemism. I wonder how many of those Christians, those followers of the way, would have made it to Jerusalem if he'd had his way. He had this letter, he had this power, he had his self-righteousness. Judaism is a beautiful faith, as is Islam and many other faith traditions. Yet, armed with his unquestionable belief that he was right and everyone else was wrong, Paul was intent on killing Christians. Think about that for a moment. How could he do this when these were also his siblings? It's easy to forget that, but let's not forget that the early Christians were Jews. Just a few years earlier, many of them would have been sitting right next to Paul in synagogue, worshiping together. And now he wanted them dead. He wanted them erased from existence. His neighbors, his friends, his family members. How? In order to do this, Paul had to dehumanize them. He had to deny their humanity and their divinity. Is that how we do it? That's an uncomfortable question to answer, and only you can answer that. Do we, like Paul the tormentor, deny the humanity and the divinity of those who are different from us so that we can then be able to criticize them, to judge them, to drive them from our communities, to deny them a place at our table, to support candidates that are passing laws that seek to erase them from existence? It is only when Paul is struck down by God on the road to Damascus, literally knocked off his ass, because he was on a donkey, by the way, when he loses something that is essential to his own humanity, his eyesight, and is then himself healed by Ananias, that he is humbled enough to be able to see the humanity and the divinity in the other. In this case, the early Christians, the followers of the way, and that he undergoes a profound transformation. Paul goes from tormentor to healer to evangelizer to the world. Let this be a lesson and a note of caution to ourselves. Must it take our own being wounded, losing our own humanity, to learn to fully love and embrace those in our communities who are not like us? If you truly believe that God is the source of all of us, and you wouldn't be here today if you didn't, then you must also believe that God is present in all of us. And if there is God in all of us, then I must love you and treat you with compassion, regardless of who you are. I don't have to approve of how you live your life in order to treat you with humanity, with dignity, with forgiveness, with compassion, with love, in order to engage with you, in order for us to work together to create a more just world. Let us fill the meanwhiles in our lives, the in-between spaces, the different aspects of our identities with love for each other. Thank you. So we have time for some discussion, for questions here in Seguin, on Zoom. You can reflect on any of what you've heard. We can go back to the earlier discussion of values. That was a really rich one about what do we struggle with? How do we try to do it better? So, and anything that you want to comment, reflect, share, this is your time. You're gonna have music in a little bit, and then we're gonna go to the panel. So. Sí, adelante, por favor.
Closer and all that, and with all the media that we have, I had some notes that I did. As a social worker that you are, you remember one of the things that you learn is the bonding that exists between the mother and the newborn. And it's what we don't have anymore. I can see all of us in here, but it's not that many here interacting, touching, talking. We may have the Zoom, and yes, everybody who's in Zoom understood what you say, but we didn't have that contact, eye contact, you know, that touch that we can be with each other. I remember being, when I was younger in San Juan, I used to take the youth to this program they had the Lutheran, and will we all congregate, all the Lutheran Hispanics will congregate in one place for a few days. And then the next day, it was all over the world. We got the congregations to come together and we worship and we learn with the youth all over the world. I don't think we have that touch anymore because of Zoom and all these other devices that we use. I know they're great and it has helped to communicate everywhere. But if we have a little bit as Christians, humans, that touch, that get together, I know the money, but that is something that back in Jesus' times, it wasn't like a very important the economical system.
Yeah.
You know, like right now, I enjoy being among all of you, learning. But now I can talk to someone and not being in my house in Zoom, wondering, you know, who's there sitting, listening to me. I mean, that would be something that we continue loving each other and getting bigger as Christians.
Yes.
That's
Gracias. You know, you raise up a really important point that I actually hadn't thought of. Technology as one more barrier to coming together. You know, when I think about it, when I reflect on it, I actually know members of my own congregation who never went back to church after the pandemic. So my parish didn't used to Zoom masses during the pandemic and started doing them during the pandemic, and they became very, very famous or popular. Famous masses, right? No mass is famous, but popular, right? Maybe the first one, but it became popular, right? And they have not gone back. You know, and so I wonder what that's about. I wonder if it's just easier. I don't have to drive. I don't have to get dressed. I don't have to, or I wonder if at some level it's like, you know, I don't have to hang out with people that maybe I didn't like that much to begin with, right? So there's two pieces to what you're saying. That's not exactly what you were saying. You're saying there's no substitute for the human connection, for coming together in the same place, worshiping together, singing together, getting to know each other, which we can't do if we just participate on Zoom. So Zoom has its places. I'm glad we're doing this because we're reaching a very large geographic area, but it's going to be important to continue these conversations in person within our own communities, lest we're using technology as a barrier, as an excuse to not have to deal with something that we don't like. You know, if my community starts to move in a direction that I'm not really comfortable with, oh, just participate on the service in Zoom and I don't have to be there and hang out. So I get the best of both worlds. I get to stay a member of the community, but I don't have to do the hard work of living those values that we were looking at every single day. So thank you for that note of caution, that let's not let technology be one more barrier. We don't need one more barrier. We already have plenty of them. Yes, please. Yes. Yeah, there you go.
Sorry. But when the pandemic was going on and we couldn't go to church, there were people that did make sure there were Bible studies and stuff that you could do on Zoom.
Yes.
And so like, especially like during Holy Week, that was important to me. And I so appreciated the people that took the time to do that.
Absolutely.
And so that way I felt like I was, even though it wasn't my own church family, I was
Yes.
communicating with people from other church families that felt like that was one way that week that they made that commitment to God and they kept it.
Absolutely.
So it's got good, but it also has bad.
Yes,
So,
And-
but that's like everything in life.
absolutely.
There's good and there's bad.
Absolutely.
And there's
And-
nothing we can do about that except pray.
Yes, absolutely. And people who checked in with each other, who would call each other, who would bring food or groceries to those in our communities that were older. So there were many people who made every effort to stay connected. So I'm just saying that the people who may be struggling with the direction of their communities, the virtual world may give them an excuse to stay connected and disconnect at the same time. So I'm saying, let's be mindful of that individual. If it doesn't apply to you, then it doesn't apply to you. We're going to go to Seguin. Yes.
Some of the previous discussions I jotted some notes and we're running out of time, but I think it relates. Because over our lunch break, I was having a discussion with one of our other brothers and sisters about how I look at the church. I'm from a Catholic background. My mother and her siblings were all raised Catholic and fairly well-to-do Black Catholic parish in Louisiana. My father is Muslim. I left the church, but at one point was agnostic and came back. My mother was atheist for a while as well. I looked at Baha'i, I have looked at Universal Unitarian Services. And ultimately what I came to is one, I like the service, the Lutheran Church, but more importantly, I like to focus on loving people in general. And the reason I left the Catholic Church was because I didn't feel like there was enough love for women. And by love, that is respecting their values, their assets, and seeing them as being as equal. That was one of the key reasons, and ELCA gives me that. I do struggle with our focus, our actual physical manifestation of working for justice. And for justice for me is that idea of not just everybody wiping the slate clean and saying, okay, we're now equal. It means you have to go back and acknowledge what was done wrong in our church or in our community and do the work, advocate for the laws, advocate for the changes, go out and work with folks physically with your hands to make things right. The other part that I struggle with, and this relates to sort of the inclusion piece, is inclusion in our society is more than about having me as the system minister as I am in my parish, right? It is about not only having people in the room, but them actually having a voice, as Dr. Torres, I think in reference earlier, and having voices as influence on the decisions that are made when the budget is being created, when ministries are being approved, when people are being put in leadership positions, or asked to step up in leadership positions, you're thinking about those things. And so how do we get there? I know that the Lutheran faith is traditionally very small, African American community within it. In most parts of the United States, there are some pockets that are very large. But for me, I chose faith because when you think about being radically welcoming to folks, when I visited my church, I visited several Lutheran churches when I was trying to decide over about a 16-month period of time in San Antonio. The local team actually came up and spoke to me. The people in the pews actually came up and spoke to me before and after service, not just when we were giving each other peace. And for basically a room of mostly Anglo folks who did not know the other, maybe one or two, to say hello, welcome, ask me about myself, invite me to come back. That says me this is a place where I might be received and accepted and be able to contribute. So radically welcoming is going out and physically doing something. And I know in our church and in a lot of churches, it's sometimes easier to just advocate, talk the gospel, but not actually live the gospel. One of the other things I wanted to mention from my notes is just the idea of working on justice. We're working on it in our parish. We have joined a larger entity called Interfaith Community Action Network of other congregations that are trying to work on justice issues, that is meeting, putting our money behind it, going to lobby, going to push our politicians to support poor people, to support the unhoused, to support people who are being oppressed based on their gender or their ethnicity, what have you, physically being there with our voices and our faces on the line. And so that gives me a little bit of an outlet for that justice, but I wish that we would figure out some ways to make it more whole and relevant in our church on a monthly basis or what have you. The last comment I'll make is about inclusion across age groups. I feel like most churches, and it's not just ELCA or Lutheran Church, or my husband is coaching, even in Catholic churches, I still have friends there, it tends to skew older. I think part of that is how we look at incorporating young people, and I'm thinking our 20-somethings. Where do we make space for them to have a voice? And I was just thinking, we ought to have a youth spot on our boards, on our executive council, that is 40 persons in that age group or less, so that their voice is heard. Because I've been in some meetings at my own church where I've had some 20-somethings say, I need this, I need that. And since the rest of the group didn't voice the same opinions, they got ignored. And if you're trying to keep the church growing, or at least sustainable, we've got to figure out a way to serve those members of the church. Right? We got to find a way, so that may be an option for us. And I just want to say, Dr. Lewis, I appreciate you sending your students to go eat non-Mexican. And while you were talking, I was thinking, they also have a conversation with those servers and managers about where those people are from. So I'm glad you said the next step was you tell them to go meet somebody who never met before and talk to the people. Because we, by being together, actually speaking and sharing, we connect when we can see the similarities in our lives and our values. And you can't get that through a Zoom meeting, even though I love Zoom to a degree. You gotta be in person, you have to actually share the ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all that. One of the things that your comments make me reflect on is a bad word. I'm going to use it. It's one of those words that the anti-woke folks want to do away with, and it's the word intersectionality. Right, the legislation that was passed in Texas actually 2 nights ago, the Senate passed the DEI bill. Of course, it now has to go to the House, and hopefully there'll be a different minds there. But one of the words that it strips out of the things we can't talk about at universities is intersectionality. And I find that really, really funny, right? Because who's pushing this? Powerful, wealthy white men for the most part, who have no intersectionality. If they had it, they would know what it was. But if you're just give me 1 second. If you're a woman and you're a Black woman and you're an immigrant and you're poor and you're a lesbian, for example, that's intersectionality. That's layers of identities that come together to actually create oppression upon oppression upon oppression upon oppression, and it's real. It is real. Intersectionality exists also in rural America, in white America. I work a lot with immigrant communities and minority communities, but I know that the largest group of poor people in the United States, do you know who they are? They're white folks. There are more poor white people in the United States than poor non-white people. And what are we doing about them? We're not helping them either, right? So if you live in a rural community and you're poor and you struggle with some type of disability, you have intersectionality too. So when these folks that are trying to erase this language, to erase the people from existence are doing it, they're also hurting their own. So why can't we see that and say enough and stop it and come together? It just, sometimes it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Florida, don't get me started on Florida, right? So the people that move in the circles that I move in, when we're feeling really, really despaired, we say, hey, at least we ain't Florida. So in Florida, they're looking at language to eliminate the word race from textbooks. Look it up if you don't believe me. Dr. Google knows a lot. Race. Now, I don't know. I think that one of the 3 legs of the Triple Crown is in Florida. So I don't know how they're going to talk about horse races if they take the term race out, right? I mean, what nonsense is that, folks? I don't care what you believe or what you feel is true Christian behavior. If you're sitting in those pews and in many others, and most faiths have codes of ethics similar to the ones that we just looked at, you got to speak up. You got to say something. You got to say enough is enough, you know, and then you got to show up and write and protest and do all the things that I know many of you are doing. Because when they come for you next, and eventually they will come for you next, there's going to be nobody left over to fight for you, right? So that's how we live these values more fully, recognizing that there but for the grace of God go I. And when they're done with this group, make no mistake about it, they're coming from my group, right? So speak about intersectionality, help people understand what it is, call our elected officials. They'll listen to you, your voters. You know, you're like somebody they really, really want to listen to. So does anybody on Zoom, Pastor Katie, that wants to share a comment or want to make sure they're feeling included as well?
We've got one from Kathy Hertzberg, who says, sometimes it's easier to reach out to those that we don't know at Target or the grocery store, as opposed to at church, where we seem to have this block because we know that people think differently than us. So complete strangers are easier to talk to because we don't know whether they think differently than us or not. It's kind of an interesting.
So familiarity gets sometimes become a barrier. Because you really, I mean, we're there every Sunday together, but the relationships are a little superficial. That's where I get from that. And we're there, we sing together, we worship together, and then once the service is over, everybody goes their separate ways. And, we don't bother to take the time to learn, maybe because we don't have the time. It's a possibility, right? There's a benign and a less benign explanation for everything. So we are all very busy. Right. And we were joking earlier before we started that in my faith tradition, the mass is an hour. And if the priest is going 52 minutes, we're looking at the watch, right? And looking at the exit. And so, and many people actually leave right after communion. You see them walk right out, right? So they don't even wait till the end of the mass, right? So time could be a factor, but maybe another factor is, this is especially true with men, by the way. You know why we don't want to go to the doctor? Somebody said it? We don't want to know if we're sick. We don't want to know what we have, right? So if we don't approach the person sitting next to us in the pew, even though we see them every single week, and we don't make an effort to get to know who they are, because we're afraid that if we get to know who they are, then we're not going to feel as comfortable sitting next to them every Sunday. But there's growth in that discomfort. We have to be brave and open up and have conversations, because otherwise you don't know when you're saying something that's hurting somebody else, that's offending somebody else. You don't know how badly that person may need you, your support, your embrace, your Christian love, how much they may need you to recognize their inherent dignity, their divinity. Ask questions. Ask questions. Are we done, Pastor, Bishop? Pastor Katie, I'll get confused. Too many pastors in here. We got one more mic in the back. Nathaniel has a last word. No pressure.
I wonder as we continue to go into deeper waters, into what it means to live it out. These values and these statements that are rooted in the gospel. What are some of the practices that will move us not to forget it, continue working on that, but at the same time, have a very relational and I will say a risk-taking encounter with others who are different? It always intrigues me that when Jesus wanted his disciples to learn something new, he will invite them to go to a different place. Let's go. It was shorter to go to Jerusalem in a straight way, but Jesus says, no, let's go through Samaria and let's go and engage the Samaritans. And we know who the Samaritans were. That is to say that our church, I'm going to make a good commercial. Our ELCA has a wonderful program called Young Adults in Global Mission. It provides opportunities for young people to experience a different place, a different culture, and to come back. Amazingly, a great number of them desire to become pastors. So that's part of the commercial, and the last part is this. Our Synod, the Southwestern Texas Synod, is growing and is discerning and is passionate and excited about all places, but in particularly some of those places where diversity is not only abstract, but is real. And we have here Pastor Julio, and we have here Emma and Eagle Pass. And right now, thanks to the good, inspirational, diverse work of Hilda, we are getting closer to have a vision for all of us in a place like that, that people will come and encounter. Let's do that also for the ministry of Iglesia Luterana San Pablo and MacArthur Lutheran Church in San Antonio, and the ministry of St. John San Juan in Austin, and the ministry of Palm Valley with English and Spanish and Korean. And perhaps that will be an opportunity, a fresh opportunity for us to somehow live these gospels. Because when you sit at the table and don't judge somebody else, but see with your own eyes, feel with your own heart, have a cup of coffee, or could be tea, or could be water. God start to work on all of us. So that's to say that we go from this place with a lot of hope.
Yes. Gracias.
Seeing as sometimes hope may seem.
Gracias, Nathaniel. Thank you. Yes, I mean, that's a great way to end these three conversations, right? That I argue you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, because that's what Jesus did. That's who he went to, right? People who needed help, and, you know, the immigrants. And remember, he was an immigrant himself, and we don't like to talk about it, but Jesus was undocumented. You know, he didn't have Egyptian citizen when they dragged his butt over the border to avoid being killed as a baby, right? And so those in need. And I just love, I'll end with your own words, Nathaniel, about maybe go from this place with the willingness to engage in, what did you say? Risky engagement. Getting to know each other is risky. You know, we risk becoming uncomfortable, but by learning stuff about each other that we didn't want to learn, but it is also immensely rewarding. And I think that the reward by far exceeds the risk, because it will enrich us all. So, gracias. Let's get back to you.
All right. Welcome back. For this final learning session of the day, we have the opportunity to hear from a panel of several different voices representing unique vantage points within the church as we further reflect on the Mientras Tanto theme. I'm Chris Stubing. I serve as Director for Evangelical Mission and Bishop's Associate for the Southwestern Texas Synod. I will moderate our panel conversation this afternoon. And I want to thank again Dr. Luis Torres Hostos for framing the challenges and opportunities of leading with love and justice in the in-betweenness of our synod. So let's thank Dr. Luis. And I've told Dr. Luis, you're not done. You can't just give us a speech and leave. You're in our territory of the Southwestern Texas Synod, and so we're in partnership together.
Absolutely.
We also have in our conversation today joining us Bishop Sue Briner. You know Bishop Sue? Yay! As well as Reverend Dr. Ruben Duran. Yay! Pastor Duran serves as senior advisor for new ministry development in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He promotes synodical initiatives and mission strategies, innovative models, nurturing life-changing relationships in new and existing communities of faith in the USA and the Caribbean. Pastor Ruben is a native of Lima, Peru. I know there's somebody, yeah, who's been to, and a graduate of Pacific Lutheran Seminary, Theological Seminary, in Berkeley, California, Trinity Lutheran College in Seattle, Washington, and the Escuela Nacional de Turismo in Lima, Peru. He served parishes in the Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles, California areas prior to becoming associate to the bishop and mission director for the Metropolitan Chicago Synod. He has also served as associate director for Latino Outreach, director for new congregations, and director for congregational vitality in the ELCA churchwide offices prior to his current position. He is with us this year as our ELCA churchwide representative for Synod Assembly. He'll be with us in a couple of weeks for our business agenda day as well. So let us welcome Reverend Dr. Ruben Duran. So the first question I'd like to ask is for Bishop Sue and Pastor Ruben. Dr. Luis has shared some of the aspects of his identity that have shaped him. What are some of the affiliations or identities that have most shaped your perspectives and faith?
Okay, I wrote it down. During the small group, I was able to write it down so it can go much faster. Okay, one would be I am a person with the ancestry of the Inca culture in Peru, and some sprinkling of Spanish, European through my mom. And so I am really a mestizo, which is a mix of the two and others. I'm a soccer player, soccer coach. I'm a business major with a travel industry experience. I am still a member of the International Association of Travel Agents. I'm a pastor in the Lutheran Church. I'm a church executive, bureaucrat, actually more burrocrat, but that's okay. I'm an immigrant with an immigrant spirit, married to Jean, who is also a Lutheran pastor. I'm a dad of 3 wonderful girls and a granddad of 4. And about grandparents, these children, they strengthen your heart, but they soften your wallet. But I don't care. That's okay. I'm a coach, a life coach, and also a young faculty in 2 seminaries. But the most important thing for me is the mestizo part. That really shapes everything, because I don't come from a monocultural view, but more of a cross-cultural, multicultural view, which is not only the present, but the future almost anywhere. And so right there, I have a gift that I would like to give, a gift that I like to share, I like live into. And so I can see it in my family. My mom and dad were not supposed to be together. My mom came from the Spanish line. My dad came from the Indian Inca. There was no way in the world they could meet, but it was in church that they met. My dad was a director of the music group, and one Sunday he was leading the music group, and all of a sudden it all stopped. And what happened? And what happened is a beautiful woman on the second pew winked at him, and he lost his place in the pentagram. So the whole thing had to start all over again. So I am the result of a musical mistake, if you will, right? So that's a mestizo part. That's how it came together. And so how interesting that because of that, you know, it happened to me too. My spouse is a German, Norwegian, Welsh. We have 3 wonderful daughters, one married to a Swede, one married to a Irish, and the last one married to Oscar from Mexico. So another grandchildren, a mix of everything. So I got basically the whole United States in my family, but now and into the future. That's what mestizo does for me. And I want that gift to be known in our church and anywhere. Good.
Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you. So I'm a kind of a mixture of stuff as well. I was born in Canada, and so I come from a culture that is kinder, quieter, and doesn't think very highly of themselves. So, you know, I start with that. We migrated when I was in high school to Miami, Florida, and I have lived in Southern cultures ever since, both on the East Coast and in Texas twice. And they have been, I grew up speaking English and learning French, and then I now have been living in cultures where I need to learn Spanish, and so I've been working on that a lot. I also come with a technology and business background, 15 years in high tech industry, and so corporate America also shaped me before I got called to seminary. I did not grow up Lutheran. I didn't really grow up much of anything. My parents got us done baptized when we were kids, just thinking that would be a good thing to do as kind of fire insurance. You know how that is. And I got confirmed as a young adult in the Episcopal Church. When all my other young adults were leaving church, I was joining it. And then I became Lutheran after I had been married for several years and before our children were born. So I didn't grow up Lutheran. I didn't grow up Texan. I didn't grow up with a lot of things that have shaped me, that now I find myself in a culture where I feel like because of my different experiences, one of my biggest identities is to be a bridge to different cultures and different ways of thinking about things. So that's some of my thing. I'm also a mom of 2 adult children, and I don't know how that happened, that I am now a mom of 2 adult children. But you know, that life goes on, right? So I am, and my faith has always informed. Actually, before I was confirmed as a young adult, I had a very active spiritual life before I ever was in church. And so I can attest to God drawing people in when they're not always aware of it. So that's me.
Thank you so much. Clap for. Thank you so much, Pastor Ruben and Bishop Sue. And we'll give Dr. Luis just another moment to catch your breath from your sharing with us, and ask you what's percolating in you with what Dr. Luis has been sharing with us today, Pastor Ruben and Bishop.
Yeah, all through the day, as I was hearing the 3 presentations, over and over again, at least in my mind, in my heart, I was coming more about this. It is about love. It is about unconditional love that God has shown to creation. God loving us so passionately, willing to give it all for that creation. And that love was incarnated. That love was made into something real. Love had wheels, if you will, because of who Jesus is and what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. So if we are that body of Christ, then what was coming to me over and over again, how can we turn on the engine that we already have, which is the love that has been put into our hearts, and put wheels on that engine? That is, how can we as people of God intentionally put action into that love by incarnating ourselves in our communities? So how can we not only plant, but deepen the roots of our church. We can't afford to be floating in society. We can't afford to be hidden little culture as Lutherans. That's not incarnation. And so that's what was coming to me over and over again. And so I hope we talk a little bit more about, and you are also thinking, so how can that be done in my community, my neighborhood? We'll get to that. But I think the most important part for me, we have that richness, we have that depth, we have that love already. So we don't need to be feeling like, oh, how are we gonna, no, it's already there. It's just a matter of how do we can navigate that and then act it out, bring it forward with gusto, with determination, with vulnerability, making mistakes, of course. But this is something that we already have.
Some words that just stuck with me, choose and choice, that we can overcome our programming at any given time if we can recognize, oh, this is a result of my programming. How do I make a different choice? Right? And we can do that with each other if we would be willing to be vulnerable, not to say, hey, Michelle, you need to make a different choice, but to say, hey, would you consider thinking about it this way? Right? So choice, work, that was another word that stuck with me, right? This is work. And this is our work as the church, right? We already have everything we need. We have been gifted with grace and love and mercy and forgiveness. And our work is to share that with others, because everybody needs to hear that. So choice, work, were two of the big words that really spoke to me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Sue and Dr. Ruben. This mientras tanto theme we have of our Synod Assembly, we're trying this out to have God's activity and presence in many places, actually on Zoom and in Seguin and in Corpus Christi today. And we know that reality within our own Synod here very well. The focus of this theme really reminds us that God's up to many things in many places all at the same time. And each of you bring a unique perspective from your vantage points of your personal and professional lives. And so how are you seeing God's presence and activity from your unique perspective? Maybe we'll give Dr. Luis a chance to share.
You know, that when Pastor Ruben was talking a moment ago about, you know, love, so it goes down to love. The thought that entered my mind is that how we're going backwards. We seem to be going backwards in time. You know, I touched a little bit on that this morning about the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament, right? God of the Old Testament was a God of fear, a God of anger, you know, a God of a jealous God, a vengeful God. To see the face of God was to die. And then the God of the New Testament is a God of love and a God of forgiveness. And we see the face of God every single day when we look at each other, right? So when I do the work that I'm doing, when I look out at a classroom full of young people that are filled with the desire to change the world, you know, many schools of social work have their slogan, be the change that you want to be in the world, and you know, and they're filled with energy and they want to fight, right? And so we have to teach them content and we teach them strategy, because you can't fight every fight the same way, right? And but part of our job is to you know, to not extinguish that fire. How do you temper it? The way that you temper, you know, a blade, you know, that make that fire, combine it with thinking and with strategy. They already come with the love. You know, there's an old musical, South Pacific, the famous song that you have to be taught to love and to hate, right? And I don't think our young people, most of them, have yet found hatred in their heart. That's what they're so easy for them to see God in the other. They may not put it in those terms. You know, many of them don't speak in religious or faith terms, but it's a gift for me to see every single day how open they are to each other, how quick they are to embrace each other, how much easier it is for them to not go to a place of judgment. So that's, I think, why I do the work I do on the education side. It keeps me young. It keeps me refreshed. It keeps reminding me that I have to check my own biases, right? I too have a chip. I too have been programmed in a particular way. And every moment of every day is a conscious choice for me to choose to think differently, to choose to act differently. And following the example of the young people that come to us for education makes my job easier. They don't know this. I wouldn't tell them this every day because then they want me to give all A's to them, right? But I learn more from them than they learn from me.
Thank you. So in preparation for the Synod Assembly and with our theme of Mientras Tanto, I sent out a roving reporter to all 8 of our conferences to interview people within congregations to talk about where they saw God at work. And we have, I hope you check out your Synod Assembly Bulletin of Reports, and we'll also be posting them on social media. But there were stories everywhere, all of the conferences, you know, and that was just one story per conference, right? So in the Alamo conference, we lifted up the amazing work that's going on in the border with Eagle Pass and Iglesia Luterana San Lucas. In the Hill Country, we looked at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Comfort that has gotten highly connected to their community and is serving in all sorts of ways. Up in the Austin area, we looked at, in Capital South Conference, we looked at, Capital North, a congregation, Lord of Life, that chose to close and leave a significant legacy to start all sorts of things and to be able to fund something called Holy Fork in the Road Ministry. And I've all over the place. When you look with eyes of hope, expecting to see God, there are stories everywhere. And you all have stories as well. And I think some of the problem is we're looking with the wrong kind of eyes, right? We're looking with eyes of, oh my gosh, we have fewer people in our pews on Sunday morning, or, you know, they're not coming like they used to, or whatever. And that's a story of loss and decline that gets us in this cycle of, like, it's a death spiral, right? But if we look in different eyes to say, to watch out for how is God already at work in our community, I promise you, when you go with those eyes, you will see God at work in different ways. And I invite you to lift up those stories, because our roving reporter would love to do more stories on you. So seriously, and I'll invite people at our next part of our assembly as well, that God is at work all over our synod, and I'm really excited about it.
Yes, I echo that. Take a look at the book of Acts. The book of Acts is, you know, basically acts of the Holy Spirit. That's what Justo Gonzalez used to say. And so something happened, people reflected, they said, oh, this is an act of God. Oh, write it down. And so they wrote it down. So the book of Acts is a written thing of things that already happened. People reflected and said, somebody else needs to know about this. So it's basically a compilation of things that God has done to encourage us on our journey. What I find encouragement these days in the church is that, you know, God is always gonna do what God's gonna do. And I hope, and my dream and work, my tail off, is for Lutherans not to miss the boat, because God is already doing what God needs to do. And let me tell you how. There is this one person in one church who said, we're being surrounded by the Latino community, lots of immigrants, let's do something about it. Yeah, you know, we'll have whatever food and clothing. No, they need to be equipped. They're asking us to equip them, like they want to know English. So English as a second language was what started. 5 people, 10 people. The word got out, 30 people. They got to around 90 people. This is St. Andrew Lutheran Church in West Chicago that I'm talking about. And so the people said to these folks of a Lutheran church, you guys, you look like a church. You smell like a church. You behave like a church. Are you a church? And they said, yeah. Well, then when are you going to invite us? Why is it that you think that we're going to come all the way here? You're teaching us English. Thank you very much. But we want to know about God too. Why is it that, so that was kind of embarrassing moment, but that's 20 years ago. Today, there are 350 Latinos average at worship in that church, all because of one woman from the church that said, I need to do something and put wheels on the love that God gave to me. And that these folks who are around me, they are, they are people who deserve God's presence and grace as well. Through English first, but then look what happened. Now you go to Philly and you find Waverly, who was keeping an eye on this new church getting started on the streets of Philadelphia among the homeless community. And Waverly finally had the guts to say to that mission developer, I know I made some mistakes. I'm trying to be forgiven and all that. And help me with that. And so Pastor prayed and all that. So, okay, next week, I got something. I'm a musician. I have a master's degree in music, and I made mistakes. That's when I'm on the street. But, if God really wants me, I think so. I want to do something about it. So he put together a homeless church choir that is singing all over the streets in Philadelphia. And so, and that brings me to the second part, which is a lot of young people from colleges and seminaries in Philly have joined this movement. And so, which is bringing a whole new ballgame, because the young adult population in this generation seem to be having a stronger sense of social consciousness. And they're saying, we know we're causing a problem, but we don't want to be the problem. We want to be part of the solution. And there seems to be almost an automatic inertia for that. So places that are inviting, places that are giving the opportunity, they are willing to do that. And that's what I see all over the place. And so those are encouraging things for us to step out of the usual. And then if you're not able to do something, equip somebody else, help somebody else to do it with you, and pray and support that person, because it's a wide open spectrum right now, and that God is doing a new thing. And I hope that we as a church can be a part of that. And then last thing I want to say, there are a lot of people out there in society who are doing God's work, but they don't know about it yet. They're doing just the regular vocation, caring for other people. They don't know that they're the very extension of love for that audience. And then they have not made the connection. Well, what an opportunity for us to build relationships and work on that.
Thank you so much. That prompts me now, Pastor Ruben, one of the places of my vantage point that I get to see that maybe most people don't have access to is sort of how the sausage is made at the church-wide organization. How the machinery works. And one of those is grants. And I work with Pastor Ruben a lot on some grants, and we have quite a few new grants in our synod for New Start Ministries over the last year, and strategic ministries in the places that have been mentioned, Pastor Nathanael that mentioned, as well as a Synod Vitality Strategy grant that we're learning how to bring leaders together in collaboration. And this gives us some funding to try some new things and do some learning similar to what we do today. Like yesterday, we brought our Latine ministry leaders, representatives of our Spanish-speaking ministries across the Synod, together here in Corpus for some networking and mutual support and prayer. In addition to that, we've just received a new grant for our Synod that is something that the ELCA has developed to help bring new life and new ways of thinking into the whole system called Holy Innovation. And we have received a grant in partnership with 5 other synods called Sembrando en los Márgenes, which is planting at the margins or sowing at the margins to support our border ministry, accompanying vulnerable congregations at the margins, direct service to migrants and asylum seekers, and build immersion experiences. But that's partnering with all the other border synods, U.S.-Mexico border synods, and our 2 other Texas synods with us. And you've helped to make that possible. Lots of things that God is doing in many places all at the same time. Thanks be to God. And the people say, amen.
Amen.
So, oh, go ahead.
I better watch my wallet here.
Just in case there's any other grants that in this passage from Acts 9, Saul goes through, or at least we see the beginning steps, maybe the baby steps of his transformation. As Dr. Luis, you put it, from tormentor to healer. How is this kind of transformation happening and needed within the church and society today? How do you think each of us in our churches could be part of it?
Please. Oh, I was signaling to you, but you said yeah, no, if we're seeing it. I mean, that's the thing. We're seeing it, and it's old expression that it's always darkest right before dawn, and the last few years for those of us that think a particular way, but those of us for whom those values that we were discussing are not just pretty words on a paper, but they're a way that we strive to live our lives, both our personal lives and our faith lives. It's been a difficult couple of years. I mean, we've seemed to be moving in the wrong direction, and yet there's places around the country where we see people who may not look like us, may not live like us, but are joining with us. They're saying, no, enough is enough. They're pushing back on some of this terrible attacking rhetoric. They're pushing back on and defeating legislation that would strip people of rights, of their inherent dignity. And so it's difficult as we conversed here amongst ourselves. Sometimes you know what the right thing to do is, but you're afraid to do it because you don't want to find yourself at the wrong end of things, right? And especially in some smaller communities that might be more conservative or more entrenched, and they just don't want to talk about anything, let alone do something about it. And the fear is legitimate that if I speak up, I'm going to find myself ostracized, right? And yet we have to recognize that God is saying to every one of us, Ananias, get your butt off of there. You've done enough praying, and go over to Saul. And it's natural to say, you want me to do what? You want me to go where? And to question it and to doubt it, but at the end of the day, to go. And there are a lot of people who are doing that, who are getting up like Ananias, and who are going and pushing back and fighting back and ensuring that social justice doesn't die, that the things that we were talking about are not just pretty words on a piece of paper, but ways in which we live our lives every single day. So we have to, those are our allies, right? I always think there's always more of us, more of people who choose love, more people who choose to embrace than those who just want to judge and point fingers and scream. But we got to find each other, and we got to come together. And we don't do that if we don't talk to each other. If you come to service every Sunday and sit in the pew next and never bother to ask, tell me a little bit more about you, or to offer, let me tell you a little bit more about me. Let's go for coffee, let's go for lunch. Let's have a conversation, let's stay. If, many congregations do a little event after service, and the same people stay and everybody else runs out the door. Let's take the time to get to know each other and to figure out who our allies are and how we can work together.
Thank you. One of the interesting areas that I'm seeing in our synod right now is, many of you know that we have the bad reputation of being the synod that lost the largest number of congregations after the 2009 decision to be welcome and inclusive of LGBTQ folks. And so when I came to this synod, all of that had just kind of happened, and nobody wanted to talk about anything at all, because to talk about it was to stir up things within families and congregations and all of that sort of stuff. So fast forward to this past year, when we started a new ministry called Technicolor Ministries, which is a networked ministry in our synod that is designed to both accompany congregations and as well as start new missional communities to those who would identify as LGBTQIA+ and those who love them. And we are getting really astounding, positive, welcoming, because here's the thing, friends, since that last happened, SCOTUS has happened, a lot of things have happened, and now pretty much everybody has somebody they know in their family, their friends, themselves, who have since come out and have said, I want to be my full self, and I want to be accepted in the church. And we recognize that as the ELCA, we made some decisions that said we allow our congregations to make those kinds of decisions. But we're saying as a synod and with this ministry that no matter what your own congregation says, there is a place for you in this church, and we welcome you. And that's just one example, I think, of ways in which we are moving forward as a synod.
When Jean and I that met in St. Paul, Minnesota, got serious about our relationship, she called her mother in California, and she flew immediately to check me out, actually to see me. And so it didn't take very long, just a few questions. And said, welcome to the family. You know, that was amazing, amazing. Except for, she said, just so you know, now your turn to come to California. So I had no idea that I would find Clifford, my father-in-law, who said from the very beginning, oh, you Mexicans, you know, like that, are here to take our jobs away, you know, and that's very, very, that was the opening, you know. So anyway, I just sat there, I stay there, you know, I'm not going to lose all this because, you know, so just hanging in there. And then he would argue. I wanted to argue, to win arguments, you know. I just stay there, asked a few questions. Sometimes he couldn't answer. And next time, another question he couldn't answer. All of a sudden, he was getting very frustrated, you know. All the way that the weeks went by, then the months went by, I heard him say to Mary, my mother-in-law, in the kitchen, you know, that Latino is very smart. That's all he said. I heard that. Like, oh, okay. Oh, hey, you know. So anyway, there is a picture before our weddings where we're like this to each other. It's a joke, but not really, before the wedding. And so, but that man, and this is what I want you to hear this, over time, began to see that his world was colliding with mine. And so his story, my story, became our story, and eventually God's story. And I didn't know that a lot of his anger was not because of me. I was just the nice target. It was his own mess over the years that had been accumulated. I didn't know that, but I would not have found out if I didn't stick around and stay there, you know, by God's grace. And then all of a sudden for him to say, you know, when my day comes, I want you to be there, you know, until my last breath. It's happening with him, happening with Mary, and lately Bishop knows that we're dealing with death in the family and all that. All of that is connected. And today in the presentation by Luis, all the stuff was just, you know, going all over the place with the beauty of our message, because I think in the end, as human people, we long for that connectedness. We all long for that. We've been programmed for so long in so many ways. It's just, you know, so sad. So I hope that as a church, we are patient enough to be able to just hang in there, be with each other, find the connections, and begin to be a community and rebuild community slowly but surely. And so I've been noticing that the people from the very margins that our society is making, there seems to be a voice coming and calling us to engage. And I think that it's just an opportunity for me. It's so missional because we don't need to win arguments or no, there seems to be an automatic opening, a connector that we can enter in with gusto, determination, fear, and trepidation, of course, but also knowing that this has happened before. And I think God is inviting our church to enter into that terrain with confidence that God's grace can be for us, sufficient for us on that journey.
And amen. That leads right into just a question about sort of from the perspective of Ananias, which you brought up, Dr. Luis. He went through his own transformation, right? Becoming willing to see Saul the way that Jesus saw him through his potential for good. Jesus called Ananias to help Saul, the one who was tormenting him. But first he had to overcome lots of stuff, right? His fear, his distrust, this real evidence of past harmful behavior. And so we sit at that place, right, where we're having these cultural collisions, and they're often harmful. And we have the whole legacy, all the legacy of pain, and that's built to where we are now. How can we overcome? How, as people of God in the church and society, how can we overcome fear, distrust, and the pain of harm done in order to help one another in our communities?
Quickly, only two things. One is there's a rational part of any conversation to help understand each other, and there is the emotional part. And so what I was trying to say before, we can put it in paper, we can do resolutions of kind that, we're gonna do this and all that. It makes sense, we vote for it. But it's the other part, that very human, that strong emotional piece. And we need time for that, but not to let go, but we need time to stay with it, but respect those emotions, those built-in, that everybody has, by the way. We're not targeting anybody. In any ethnic community, we got our own prejudices. And so we're speaking to everybody here. So please, I hope we get clear about that. That we just need that time to be able to wrestle with that. And to do it in community, for me, is the best way. In community, we listen, learn from each other. It's amazing, the wisdom that is already there. And I learned so much to be a Lutheran pastor, going to homes of Norwegians and Germans and Swedes and Finns, and just sit there, drink the coffee, eat the donuts, but then listen and listen. And the stories of grace of God's people are amazing. They didn't speak a word at church, but in their home when I was there, yes. But it was so much fun for me to knock on the door, let's say Mrs. Sorensen, and you could hear, hey, the pastor's here, get the Bible out. They lift up the lamp, get the Bible out, put it in there, like that. Then other Lutheran families say, the pastor's here, is the beer cold? They were gonna give beer. So it's just amazing. I just love so much being a pastor in a cross-cultural way, because the humanness all comes out. And God's grace, it really opens it all up. I mean, we're willing to do that. Wow. We can be God's people with anybody because we have that ability that's God-given. We just need to, the rational piece, put it in there, but let the emotional piece take its time. It takes time. So we got to be patient with that.
Emotional, relational. Yeah, thank you. I was thinking this morning of when you talked about your social work students going to making them go to another restaurant, and then the lovely young lady here that talked about, get them to talk to somebody else as well. And I wondered what it would be like if every single one of us made it a point once a week, even, to say, where could we go to in our cities and our towns and our farmlands, because there are diverse people all around us. Where could we go to meet somebody that we don't think is like us? Just to have a conversation, whether it's at a coffee shop or the local gas station or whatever. And what if we were brave enough to introduce ourselves to somebody and just to say, hi, I've never met you before, and this is a little scary for me, but I'd like to learn something about you or whatever, right? What would it be like if we each did that one conversation a week with somebody who wasn't like us? What sort of transformation might go on inside of us to make us more open to where the Spirit is sending us?
Yeah, I love that.
And then I would take it one step further and I said, what,
That could be scary.
yeah, well, it's scary, but it's in your ethics statement. You know, I said this morning as we were going through the ELCA values, that for me, the two most powerful words in that entire document were radical acceptance, right? That regardless of what I learned by sharing bread or conversing with somebody else, regardless of how similar we are or how dissimilar we are, that I'm going to practice that radical acceptance and I'm going to see God in you and I'm going to embrace you as my sibling. You know, what a different world we would live in if each one of us would do that. Radical acceptance.
Thank you.
Amen. One more question. And this one is for you all, but it's also for the rest of us as well in our different contexts. And so just sort of prompting you to be thinking about something that you might want to share with the group as our panel participants think about this as well. What would be some steps, big or small, we could take to put our values into practice? Take that whole list. We could read through them again that Dr. Louise shared with us that are part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Some steps, big or small, that we could take away from this gathering to begin to have that integration of our values and our actions. So if there's folks here or in Seguin or on Zoom, think about that, and Pastor Katie can wave and
invited you into a once a week conversation with someone you didn't know. I could also say, what would it look like in your own congregations? Because you may or may not know everyone in your congregations, but what would it look like to have a conversation with someone you did not know before? And or what would it look like to do the identities conversation in your congregation? The way in which we did it this morning, talking about our different identities as kind of what we would call reasonably friendly folks to start with, right? But to practice that, oh yeah, we all do have different identities. And I had no idea that you had, you know, this kind of a life beforehand, or I had no idea that we were connected in this way, right? An easy, pretty easy step. You all are, by virtue of being here, leaders in your own communities. And so how might you consider leading something like that in your faith community?
Want to open it up? I want to make sure, yeah.
hold on just a moment. We'll get a microphone.
They come in.
Oh, we need one of these. Here we go.
Thank you. I had to take the notes because this is an issue that even though I'm coming from another country and I had known a lot of immigrants because I'm an ESL teacher, so I know how to deal with all this population that comes into this country. And one issue that we haven't seen as Christians or social work, I don't know, maybe it is there and I don't know. The mourning of our people. Many of my students, when they come to this country, they lost someone or the parents lost, you know, sometimes a child. I was very blessed that at my church, we have the Stephen Minister program. Unfortunately, we only have one Spanish speaker Stephen Minister, which is me. And lately, I had a lot of people who passed away that they were immigrants. So my director and the Stephen Minister had tried to help me to get all these books and everything to help them. And I tried my best. I had a letter that I translate because it's not a program for such a thing. Mourning and these people that comes and, you know, and La Bestia which is the train that everybody travels in there, or when they cross the river and they lost someone. And I know it's a very hard issue to deal with, the death. I had tried very hard to get help, to help those ones who lose somebody and they don't speak English. They are in a new country. They probably never found their loved one and nobody can help them. It's not their program. To me, it's a big concern because I had tried very hard to help them. Also, we don't have access to them because the community, not only the Lutherans, but any church or social workers are not aware that much of how they feel. And I know in the Bible, Jesus Christ went to help, I brought it down. Hold on. This, his best friend, which Lazarus, yes. And he mourned with Martha and Maria. And he was there for them and loved them. And he loved this person who was his friend. And we haven't looked in that into the immigrants, which is a big issue for a lot of people in this country. And I know San Lucas and Eagle Pass, they are going to open a great program. And it's something that is needed from us. To me, it's so important. I got trained, thanks God, these people in Palm Valley. But as I say, they had tried very hard to explain all the books and everything. And for me to understand English and then translated my brain into Spanish. But it's a program that make me think about how they mourn and there's no one there to hold them when they have this pain and they don't know where their loved ones are because sometimes they get lost in the river or they get lost as they come across the countries. And I wonder if it's any way we can open our hearts to them and get more Stephen minister educated to help them.
For me, one important thing that today, as I was reviewing and reflecting, something important in my life, and that is to see the neighbor not as an object, but as a subject. That there's some wisdom, there's a whole worldview, there's a lot in that other person, where, as I learned today, to see God, to see the presence of Christ there, and be vulnerable enough, humble enough to be able to enter into mutual learning and a relationship. I understand within the Synod, there are folks who are being encouraged today to make that first small step to build relationships. But there are some folks and congregations in the Synod who are already deeper, in a deeper way, involved in restoring community. Thank you. And we encourage you today and thank you and affirm you today. Keep it up, keep it going. Some people and churches in this Synod are serving in a different way, advocating, actually standing up, trying to change the laws and to be able to be more fair to people and all that. Thank you for that. There's room for everybody. And what we talk today is not to single one, but rather to whatever you are in the continuum, in the spectrum. The love of God is in you, and it's just ready to be spill over, with others and the neighbors. So I just want to express that word of thankfulness to all of you, wherever you are, and that we can be on the move, on the movement of expressing that love, wherever we are.
Amen. Thank you. We have someone who wants to share in Seguin.
And my first thing I wanted to share with you all is that tomorrow will be my 1-year anniversary from when I suffered a brain aneurysm that should have killed me. I spent 2 weeks in a caused coma, my husband and two beautiful daughters stood by my side, not knowing if I was going to live till the next day or the next day. Had pneumonia twice. Just anything that could go wrong went wrong to leave them in that sense of jeopardy. And I woke up and things were pretty much okay. And I praise God for that gift. I raised my hand earlier when he asked if anybody got in their car and had to think, adjust the rear view mirror, make sure my seatbelt's right. I raised my hand. I have only driven my car 5 times maybe in the past year, and it has been scary as hell. For everybody on the road who knew I was driving that day. But in this time of grace and growing and being renewed and believing in my heart of hearts that God has more work for me to do, there have been 3 thoughts going through my mind again and again today. And one is that when Ananias, however you say it, but when he finally saw that he had no choice but to go to Saul, the first words out of his mouth were, "Brother Saul." Could we all, in our hearts, when we meet that new person, can we acknowledge them as our brother or our sister in Christ? And if we can, how might that shape that relationship from the get-go? Because obviously, it knocked down walls immediately for Ananias and for Saul. Secondly, Margaret Mead has a quote that I have as a pin at home, and it is, never believe that one person cannot change the world. Because indeed, that is most often how it happens. And so, you all as my witnesses, I live in Austin. There is a governor of our state who I do not understand. I don't. But my goal will be to meet him, call him brother, and share who I am with him and try to get him to share who he is with me. We can take small steps, we can take medium-sized steps, and we can take giant steps. And I believe that is what God is calling us in the Lutheran of all churches to do. We have not been an evangelical church per se, but I believe the time has come that Lutherans make a little noise. Well, or I should say, since Martin Luther, honoring that he started it all, but that we should reach out.
Amen. I think we need to kind of bring this to a close and pray. And then we're going to be ready, get ready for worship. I know there's probably lots stirring. Were there any comments on Zoom by chance that we? No? Okay. But I'm going to invite you to continue sharing those and even to take them back to your congregations, into your daily prayers. This is really an invitation for all of us. Mientras tanto, right? All the time, everywhere, God is with us and God is active. Thank you for what you've shared. Thank you for our panel participants. The Lord be with you. God, we thank you this day for your love and your grace, for the way that you show up for us, calling our names. Whether in any given moment we find ourselves to be like Saul, or like Ananias, or like both of them at the same time. You call to us and you invite us to get back to basics and to lead with love. May your Holy Spirit fill us this day, for each one of us individually, for each of our congregations, for our whole synod, for our denomination, and for this world you love so much. We pray this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.